The cardboard box held everything left of 11 years. 3 dinner plates her mother had brought to the wedding, wrapped in sections of the Tulsa world from the week of the ceremony. A coffee mug with a chip on the rim that had been there since year 2 of the marriage and that nobody had ever thrown away. A rubber band ball her son Daniel had made in 2nd grade, at the height of a phase when he couldn't sit still in class and his teacher had suggested he needed something to do with his hands. 2 framed photographs with the glass cracked during the move. One of Claire at 31 standing in front of the Denver Art Museum with her hair blown sideways by the wind off the Rockies, smiling at whoever held the camera. In that photograph, she was still herself. She could see it clearly now, 3 months and 4 days after the divorce papers were signed, sitting on the floor of a 400-square-foot apartment in Garland, Texas, surrounded by what remained of a life she had spent 11 years building. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Marcus had taken the house, both cars, the savings account that held $94,000 in money she had helped earn through 7 years keeping the books for his construction company, managing invoices, tracking payables, pulling the business through lean winter months when new contracts dried up and the cash flow charts she maintained looked like a coastline in distress. He had taken the furniture, the kitchen table where Daniel did homework every night from 3rd grade through 6th, the bed frame she'd picked out because it was solid oak and would last, the couch they'd bought after the first good year of the business when Marcus said they deserved something that wasn't held together by a bolt from a college dorm room. She had loved him once. That was the thing she made herself hold on to when the anger threatened to become the whole story. She had loved him genuinely, in the early years, before the business consumed all of his attention and her career became the thing that could be sacrificed without visible cost because it was hers and not his. He had been charming in the way certain men were charming, attentive and decisive and good in a crisis, the kind of presence that made a room organize itself around him without his asking. She had mistaken that for solidity. It was only later, much later, that she understood the difference between someone who was reliable and someone who was simply certain of themselves, and that the second quality, without the first, was a very convincing imitation of something it was not. He had filed the papers in February. By March, she was in the Garland apartment. By April, she was apologizing to strangers for their broken appliances. His lawyer, a man who wore cufflinks to depositions and spoke in a voice calibrated to make opposing counsel feel the futility of resistance, had argued that because the construction business was Marcus's sole proprietorship, all accounts connected to it were excluded from the marital estate. The judge had agreed. 2 months after that ruling, the house sold and Marcus received 60% of the equity under the settlement terms Claire's own attorney had advised her to accept, because continuing to fight would cost more than she stood to gain. What Claire received in total, $11,000, deposited once and never supplemented. A 2007 Honda Civic she had purchased with borrowed money from her mother because the settlement check took 3 weeks to clear and she had nowhere to be in the meantime. A box. She was 43 years old and she worked the 6 a.m. shift at a call center in Mesquite that handled warranty claims for a chain of appliance manufacturers. The job paid $16.50 an hour and required her to wear a headset and apologize to strangers for their broken refrigerators, their dishwashers that stopped mid-cycle, their washing machines that walked across the laundry room floor and pulled the drainage hose loose from the wall. She did this for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and then she drove home in the Civic with its cracked dashboard and its passenger window that wouldn't seal completely against wind, and she made dinner on a 2-burner electric stove in a kitchen where she could touch both walls simultaneously if she stretched. The call center was a place where time worked differently than it did elsewhere. The Q indicator at the top of each agent's monitor counted calls waiting, and when it read 0, you had a few seconds of silence that felt luxurious in a way that nothing outside that building would have called luxury. Her supervisor was a man named Terrence who wore polo shirts in every color and had the patient, contained quality of someone who had worked very hard to stop being bothered by things that had once bothered him. He told her, in her first week, that the key to the job was to understand that the person on the other end of the call was not angry at her personally. They were angry at a situation. Her job was to be the voice that existed between their anger and the system that produced it. Some days she was able to maintain that understanding clearly. Some days she sat at her station at 6 in the morning listening to someone in Omaha explain that their refrigerator had failed during Thanksgiving and everything was ruined, and they wanted to know who was going to pay for it. And she thought, I understand exactly what you mean. Daniel was 17. He had chosen to stay with his father during the school year, and his father's lawyer had made that choice sound during proceedings like evidence of something Claire couldn't quite name. She understood the actual reason. Marcus had kept the house, which meant Daniel kept his bedroom, his school district, his dog, his friends within walking distance, the whole architecture of a life that had been assembled over years. Claire had a fold-out couch and a parking lot that smelled of other people's cooking. At 17, you didn't choose between parents so much as between recognizable and unrecognizable, and Claire's life had become something her son didn't fully recognize yet. She told herself he'd visit more in the summer. Some days she believed it. Daniel called on Wednesday evenings, usually from his bedroom, and the calls lasted between 7 and 12 minutes depending on what he had going on afterward. He was careful with her, which was its own kind of loss. That particular care a teenage boy developed when he didn't know how to handle an adult's pain without absorbing it. He asked about the apartment, about the job, about whether she'd seen any movies. He didn't ask about the divorce or about his father, and she didn't bring either up. They talked about school, about the friends she'd watched grow up through middle school and who were now applying to colleges. They talked about the dog sometimes. Once he said, very quietly, at the end of a call, that he missed having her in the house at dinner, and she had said that she missed it too. And they both let the silence sit there for a moment before he said he had homework, and they hung up. She'd sat with the phone in her lap for 20 minutes after that, not crying exactly, just sitting. On the Saturdays when Daniel didn't have a game or a thing with friends, he would sometimes drive over to Garland in the used Jeep Marcus had helped him buy at the start of the school year. He'd sit on the fold-out couch and eat whatever she made, and they'd watch something on her laptop propped on a stack of library books because she didn't own a television. Those afternoons were the best part of the week without being fully comfortable. Two people learning a new version of each other in a space that didn't fit the old version of either of them. She was grateful for every one of them. She was also aware that 17-year-olds had better things to do on Saturday afternoons, and that gratitude carried its own specific weight. She told people she was fine. Her sister Donna believed this for approximately 2 weeks before her phone calls shifted in register from supportive to careful, the way people speak to someone they've decided is struggling but don't know how to help without making it worse. Her mother called every Sunday from Tulsa and asked practical questions. How was the apartment? Was she sleeping? Had she talked to Daniel this week? And never pushed past the answers Claire gave, which was its own kind of grace. Claire worked the early shift, made coffee in a French press she'd kept from the marriage because Marcus had never learned how to use it and therefore hadn't wanted it, ate cereal over the kitchen sink most mornings, and went to bed each night at 9:30 because exhaustion was the only thing that reliably silenced the calculations her mind ran on its own. She was not depressed. She had been meticulous about that distinction since April, since the week after Marcus filed when she'd gone 2 full days without eating properly and hadn't noticed until she nearly fainted in the produce section of a Kroger and had to sit on a bench by the floral department while a stock boy brought her a small cup of water and tried not to make it weird. She had called a therapist after that, a woman named Dr. Patrice Hollis with an office in Richardson who took Claire's insurance and had Tuesdays at 5:30 open. They met every other week. Dr. Hollis had said in their 3rd session that what Claire was grieving was not the marriage exactly, but the version of herself she had organized her life around for over a decade. That was the most accurate thing anyone said to Claire in 2023. In their 6th session, Dr. Hollis had asked what Claire had wanted before Marcus, before the construction company, before she'd traded one version of her life for another at 29 and decided to call it a choice. Claire had told her about the auction house in Fort Worth, about the work, the provenance research, the particular satisfaction of standing in front of a painting and reading what it held. Dr. Hollis had said, "Do you miss it?" Claire had said yes without any hesitation, which surprised her. She'd told herself for years that she'd simply moved on to a different kind of work, that bookkeeping and appraisal both required precision and attention, and there was no reason to rank one above the other. That had been something she told herself. It had not been accurate. What she hadn't found yet was a self to organize around instead. The lease on the Garland apartment ran 12 months. She had enough money to cover 9 of them. maybe 10 if she cut therapy to once a month and dropped her phone to the cheapest data tier. After that, the math became a different kind of problem. She kept a spreadsheet on her laptop with the numbers updated each Sunday. The same evening her mother called, and the spreadsheet had stopped feeling like planning several weeks ago. It felt more like documentation. That was the life she was living in the first week of November, for months after the divorce became final, when the email arrived. It came from a company called Dallas County Lien Storage Solutions, addressed to Claire Moreau, the last name she'd reclaimed after the divorce was finalized. The subject line read, Outstanding Balance Notice, Unit 4C, Rental Agreement M. Donovan, Emergency Contact on File. She almost deleted it without opening. The body of the email was brief and automated in tone. Storage Unit 4C at the facility on South Buckner Boulevard in Dallas had been rented under the name Marcus Donovan since March 2017. The account was 6 months past due. Under the terms of the rental agreement and Texas Property Code Section 59, the facility would proceed to auction the unit's contents if payment was not received within 30 days. As the emergency contact listed on the rental agreement, Claire was being notified as a courtesy. She was welcome to contact the facility to discuss resolution options. She read the email twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly, the way she had learned to read financial documents during 7 years of keeping Marcus's books. She had processed every expense that passed through their accounts during those 7 years. Business and personal. Every credit card statement, every bank transaction, every line on every tax return she'd prepared alongside their accountant. She had never, not once, seen a payment to Dallas County Lien Storage Solutions. She had never seen a deduction for a storage rental on South Buckner Boulevard. She had never been asked about any storage unit during the divorce proceedings, not by Marcus's lawyer, not by her own, not in any deposition or disclosure. Which meant one of two things. Either the unit had been rented and paid in cash, off the books, which was possible but seemed excessive for whatever it held, or Marcus had simply forgotten it existed. She thought about how that could happen. The unit had been rented since March 2017. For 6 years, it had presumably been paid automatically, charged to whatever card Marcus had connected to the account. Sometime in the past year, around the time he restructured all his accounts after the divorce was filed, that card had been canceled or replaced. The automatic charges had stopped hitting. Marcus, who at any given time had 3 active business accounts and 2 personal cards and ran his financial life at a level of deliberate detachment from details he considered someone else's job, had not noticed. The charges had been small enough, presumably, to vanish into the background noise of his finances without triggering a call from the facility. 6 months later, the facility sent a notice to the emergency contact on the original agreement. The emergency contact had been Claire. She looked up the facility online. The listing for Unit 4C was already posted on the public auction board. Contents unknown. Starting bid, $1. Auction date, December 4th. She sat with her laptop on her fold-out couch for a long time after that. She had known Marcus Donovan well enough to catalog his habits precisely. He was not a man who accumulated junk. He didn't hold on to things out of sentiment, didn't have a garage full of projects he never finished, didn't rent space to store furniture he couldn't bear to discard. If Marcus had rented a storage unit in 2017 and maintained payments for years without ever mentioning it, he had put something specific inside, and then, for reasons she couldn't explain, walked away from it. And then, in the chaos of the divorce and the restructuring and the general administrative upheaval that followed, he had forgotten the unit existed. The thing that kept her from closing the laptop and going to bed was simple arithmetic. She had kept his books. She knew what Marcus owned, what he'd declared, what had been divided. A storage unit he'd never disclosed and had apparently forgotten meant its contents had never entered any accounting. Whatever was inside had not been negotiated over. It had not been assessed. It was not part of any settlement. It had been rented in his name. But the auction was public, and it started at $1. She found herself thinking about Otto Donovan that night as she sat at the small table in her kitchen eating leftover soup from a container. Marcus had not talked about his grandfather in any sustained way. He'd mentioned him occasionally, the way people mention figures who shaped them without knowing how. Otto had worked in machine manufacturing after arriving in the States, had built something modest and durable in Denton, had been quiet and private and careful with money. He'd spoken German at home until Marcus's father stopped responding in kind, and then he stopped speaking it at all. He'd kept the house meticulously. He'd died with no debts and a modest estate that moved through probate in under 8 months. What Claire knew about post-war German immigration from her graduate research was that people who left in the years immediately following 1945 carried things with them in 2 categories: what they declared and what they didn't. The declared assets were taxed, inspected, sometimes confiscated. The undeclared ones moved differently, through connections and intermediaries and the particular ingenuity of people who had watched everything disappear once and were determined not to let it happen again. Art was portable in a way that land was not. A painting could cross a border in a suitcase. It could live behind a false wall. It could travel with a family and never appear on any manifest. She was probably wrong. She told herself that several times before she fell asleep. She called her sister the next morning before the call center shift. Donna picked up on the second ring. She was clearly in the middle of something, the background noise carrying the particular texture of her sister's domestic multitasking. Donna had been married 14 years to a man named Greg who sold commercial real estate in the northern suburbs. They had a house in Allen with a backyard pool, 2 kids who played travel soccer, and the kind of ordered life that had begun to feel, in Claire's current circumstances, like a thing seen through glass. Donna volunteered at her church's food pantry on Thursday mornings and wore her generosity openly, which sometimes made her advice land harder than she intended. Claire explained the email. There was a pause. How do you even know there's anything worth looking at in there? I don't. I'm saying Marcus never mentioned it. It wasn't in any of our disclosures, and he forgot to pay it. Marcus doesn't forget things like that. He forgot to pay it for 6 months straight, Donna. That's in the email. Another pause, longer this time. What are you thinking? That you're going to go bid on it? That's what I'm considering, yes. Claire heard a cabinet close on the other end of the line. When her sister spoke again, her voice had that particular careful quality, the one that meant she was choosing words to manage a situation. I understand this year has been genuinely awful, and I'm not dismissing that. But showing up to bid on Marcus's storage unit seems like it's going to make you feel worse, not better. Whatever's in there, he put it there in 2017 and never went back. That's 6 years of a storage unit he didn't care about. It's probably old business files. Equipment he didn't want to haul anywhere. Maybe boxes of stuff from his grandfather's place after the estate cleared. Maybe, Claire said. I just don't want you to drive across Dallas on your day off and spend money you don't have and find yourself standing in front of a unit full of boxes of someone's old tools and feel like this is the thing your life has become. Claire was quiet for a moment. It starts at $1. That's not the point I'm making. I hear you. She kept her voice neutral. I'm going anyway. Donna exhaled slowly, not quite a sigh. Okay, let me know how it goes. Her coworker Pam, who sat 2 stations over and ate the same turkey wrap every single day at noon without variation or apparent regret, had a different kind of input when Claire mentioned it on their afternoon break. Pam listened with the expression she used for things she found interesting rather than concerning. There was a show about this, she said. Storage unit auctions. One guy found a human body once. Frozen. She paused. Well, frozen in the sense that the unit had been climate controlled. The body, I mean, which is somehow more disturbing. She took a bite of her wrap. But usually it's just furniture. My cousin did one of those and got 3 treadmills. She sold 2 of them. Made like $200 total, which was more than she paid. So, that was the sum of encouragement available to Claire Moreau in the last week of November. One sister who thought it was desperate. One coworker who raised the subject of frozen bodies. She booked the day off anyway, using one of her remaining personal days. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. December 4th was a Thursday. Claire drove the 22 miles from Garland to South Buckner Boulevard in what passed for morning traffic in Dallas. The kind of slow, joyless movement that characterized every road in the city between 7 and 9 regardless of direction or purpose. The dashboard thermometer read 41 degrees. The sky was the flat, pressing gray of Texas winter, low clouds lying against the horizon like something that had given up trying to lift. The facility was exactly as it had appeared in the Google Street View she'd looked at 3 times in the preceding week. A long concrete block building set back from the road behind a chain-link fence with a barbed wire top rail. A parking lot with a few trucks and one van. A glass front office with a handwritten sign taped to the inside of the door that said, "Please check in with office before proceeding to auction site." She parked and sat with the engine running for a moment. She had brought $40 cash. Not because she expected to spend it, but because she had told herself she wasn't going to be the kind of person who showed up to a dollar auction with no money in her pocket and then pretended the outcome didn't bother her. The $40 was a psychological position. She was also aware, somewhere behind that reasoning, that she didn't know why she'd driven here, not really. Her sister's voice had been in her head on and off since their conversation, laying out the reasonable interpretation of events. Marcus forgot. It's junk. You're hoping for something that isn't there because you need something to hope for. The last part was probably accurate. She was here anyway. The office smelled of old coffee and the faint sweetness of a plug-in air freshener shaped like a pine tree hanging near the door. The man behind the desk was mid-50s, close-cropped gray hair, reading glasses on a chain. He checked her ID against the sign-in sheet, had her sign a standard liability release, and explained the terms without looking up from his computer. Cash or card accepted. Winners required to take possession of all contents within 48 hours or arrange additional storage at standard rates. No returns. No partial claims. All contents transferred as is. How many people usually come to these? Claire asked. Depends on the unit. He printed her a slip with a gate code and an auction number. Got 3 other check-ins before you for this one. The auction area was past a low gate in the second row of storage units, a narrow corridor of orange roll-up doors running the length of the building. Unit 4C was 2/3 of the way down, its door padlocked. For people were already standing in the loose, purposeful way of people who did this with regularity. 2 men in their late 30s stood together and talked in low voices. Resellers, from the practiced ease of them, the way they scanned without appearing to. An older woman, maybe 60, standing alone a few feet away, who'd arrived in a truck Claire had seen in the lot. And a younger man with a phone out who appeared to be photographing the unit's exterior door, which struck Claire as something between professional and odd. She joined the group at an appropriate distance, hands in her coat pockets. The auctioneer was a compact woman named Amy, according to the orange vest she wore. She arrived at 9:10 with a clipboard and a small portable speaker that was playing the end of a country song before she reached over and clicked it off. She explained the terms in the brisk, practiced way of someone who'd said the same words several hundred times. She unlocked the padlock, removed it, and pulled the door upward. The contents of Unit 4C were immediately visible from the threshold. Open metal shelving ran along both walls. No stacked furniture blocking the view. No curtain of hanging clothes obscuring the back. Someone had organized this space deliberately. The shelving held plastic storage totes in 2 colors, dark blue and gray, each with a white label and hand-printed block letters. Beyond the shelving, at the back wall, and along the left side, 7 objects stood upright on the floor. Flat, roughly rectangular, each wrapped in a moving blanket secured with brown packing tape, each approximately the height of a framed painting. Each built into what appeared to be a custom wooden crate. The 2 resellers stepped forward by half a step. Claire stayed where she was. She was standing in front of a storage unit in a light industrial block off South Buckner Boulevard in Dallas on a 41-degree Thursday morning, and she was looking at objects she recognized. She had not always taken warranty claim calls in Mesquite. There had been a different life before. She'd spent 2 years at SMU earning a master's degree in art history, writing her thesis on the provenance recovery work done by Dutch museums in the post-war period. The long effort to trace paintings that had moved through Europe during the Nazi occupation and resurface, decades later, in estate sales and auction houses and private collections where their owners sometimes did not know or did not ask what history the works carried. After that, she'd spent 3 years as a junior appraiser at Hartley & Crane, a mid-size auction house in Fort Worth that handled estate work and mid-market art sales. She'd done condition assessments, provenance research, catalog descriptions. She'd learned to read a painting the way a doctor reads an X-ray, looking past the surface for the evidence of what lay underneath and what had happened to it over time. The most important thing her supervisor at Hartley & Crane had ever told her was that the first 30 seconds in front of a work told you everything you needed to know about whether it was worth your time, not whether it was authentic. You couldn't know that in 30 seconds. But whether the surface had the quality of age that couldn't be manufactured, whether the paint layer had the density of accumulated history, whether the object before you had the presence of something that had existed long enough to absorb time into itself. Fakes didn't have that. Reproductions didn't have it. A painting 400 years old carried its own weight in a way that you felt before you could articulate. She had given that up in 2009 when Marcus's construction business expanded fast enough that someone needed to be in the office full-time, and that person, by mutual agreement that had somehow never been revisited, was her. She told herself she'd go back. She hadn't gone back. 14 years was a long time to tell yourself something was temporary. But the knowledge was still there. It sat in her body like a language she'd stopped speaking but never lost. Those wooden crates along the left wall were not repurposed pallet wood or shipping containers pressed into secondary use. They were purpose-built. She could see it from 20 feet in the proportions, the corner joinery, the recessed metal handles bolted to the side panels rather than surface-nailed. Art shipping crates were built to move valuable objects without vibration or impact damage. The hardware was specified for repeated use. The foam lining inside, when properly done, was cut to fit the individual work being transported. You didn't build crates like that to store tools or office files. She had no knowledge of Marcus owning anything that would require this kind of transport. The art in their house during the marriage had been 3 pieces he'd bought at charity fundraisers because they looked like something that belonged on walls, and 1 Western landscape print his grandmother had left him that had hung in the downstairs hallway since the year they married. None of those required custom crating. None of those had warranted a climate-controlled storage unit on South Buckner Boulevard for 6 years. The auctioneer began the bidding. One of the resellers opened at $5. His partner didn't counter, which confirmed they were working together. The older woman from the pickup bid $8. The young man with the phone bid $10. The first reseller said $12. The woman shook her head. The young man scrolled his phone for a moment, then stepped back from active bidding. $12. Claire raised her hand. She didn't have a strategy. She had 2 things: 25 years of knowing how to read what she was looking at, and $11,000 in total assets standing between her and a situation with no good endings. Neither of those things was a plan, but she raised her hand. Anyway, and she said 15. The reseller looked at her briefly. He said 17. She said 20. He said 22. She said 25. He did the arithmetic of the situation. A storage unit he couldn't inspect, with contents that might be worthless once you accounted for hauling costs. He'd been doing this long enough to know that most units that looked interesting from the doorway paid out less than the bidding price once you factored everything. He shrugged, stepped back. $25, Amy said. Going once. Going twice. Sold. Claire paid with a 20 and a 5. Amy handed her a new combination lock and a receipt with the unit number printed on it. The other bidders were already moving back toward the parking lot. The resellers walked easily, unhurried, already discussing the next unit down. The older woman from the pickup had driven off before the door was fully raised. The young man with the phone was on a call, walking in the opposite direction. Claire was alone in front of Unit 4C. She stood at the threshold for a longer moment than she intended. The win had cost her $25. She was now the legal owner of the contents of a storage unit rented by a man who had spent 3 years in a divorce proceeding systematically demonstrating that she was worth less than she knew. She felt something about that, standing there in the December cold, but it wasn't triumph. Not yet. Not anything so clean. It was more like the feeling of having made a move you couldn't take back and deciding to see what it meant. The unit smelled of cool, dry air and old cardboard, and something she identified more slowly, something that sat underneath the obvious smells. Linseed oil. The particular resinous warmth of it, faint but present, the smell of a painter's studio absorbed into objects over time. Climate-controlled storage maintained humidity and temperature within narrow ranges. On the surface, it seemed expensive for old business files. It was standard, essential practice for storing paintings on canvas or panel. Canvas expanded and contracted with humidity changes. Paint cracked along those expansion lines. Wood panels were even more sensitive. Put a panel painting in a non-climate unit in Texas, where the air could swing from 90% humidity in August to 20% in February, and you were looking at progressive, irreversible damage. Whoever had stored these crates had known that. She started with the totes. She owed herself the discipline of not going directly to the thing that interested her before checking the thing that might answer her questions more simply. The first tote, labeled Files 2015 to 2016, contained exactly that. Accordion folders, rubber-banded into groups, full of job invoices and supplier receipts from the construction business. She recognized some of the vendor names. She closed the tote and set it aside. The second held new office supplies still in packaging, a staple gun still in its clamshell, an unopened tape dispenser, a box of cable management clips. Third tote. Equipment manuals, the kind printed on cheap paper and bound with plastic combs, for machinery she couldn't name. All of it as boring as Donna had predicted. She turned to the wooden crates. 7 of them, in a row along the left wall. The largest was roughly 4 feet wide, and perhaps 3 feet tall. The smallest was closer to 2 feet wide, under 3 feet tall. They varied in age. She could see that even wrapped in moving blankets, because the wood of the crates varied in color from pale and relatively new to darker, older grain that had been sitting longer. None of them were labeled. She chose the smallest first, the one closest to the door. She undid the packing tape along the top edge and pulled the moving blanket away. Inside, a wooden panel sat recessed in custom-cut foam that had yellowed at the edges but held its shape perfectly. The foam had been cut to the specific dimensions of this panel and nothing else. The panel was turned face inward, presenting its back to her. She lifted it free of the foam carefully, cradling it at the sides, and turned it over. The painting was small. Oil on panel. Landscape. Trees in the middle distance and a sky above them rendered in a way that spoke of layered technique, of glazes built up over time to create depth through transmitted light rather than surface texture. The palette had the amber warmth that developed in old paintings over decades and centuries, the yellowing of aged varnish over original pigment, something that could be approximated but never quite replicated in modern work. Claire stood very still. Her training was not something she had to retrieve from memory. It was present immediately, the way a physical skill returns to the body when the body needs it. She tilted the panel slowly, letting the light from the open unit door cross the surface at a low angle. In raking light, a painting's surface history became visible. The cracking of the paint layer, what specialists called craquelure, could tell you how old the work was, whether it had been repainted, whether the surface had been damaged and restored. It was not infallible, but it was unmistakable when you knew what you were looking at. The craquelure on this panel was not regular. It did not run in the parallel mechanical lines produced by manufactured aging, the kind sold to tourists as authentic. It ran in organic, shifting networks across the surface, varying in depth and distribution, following the grain of the wood support beneath in ways that indicated real contraction of a paint layer over real time. The cracks were not decoration. They were a record. She turned the panel over. The back was dark with age that didn't come from stain or treatment. The grain of the wood was close and fine, old-growth timber cut before the 20th century, when trees grew slowly and the resulting wood had density modern equivalents rarely matched. Along the top edge, partially obscured by settled grime, she could see marks. She brought the panel closer to the available light. 3 marks. The first was a collector's stamp, circular. The ink faded to near illegibility, the kind applied to the back of works as they moved through collections over generations. The second was a handwritten notation in what appeared to be German, for words she could only partially make out through the grime. The third was a small red seal, the kind applied by customs authorities or export offices to works moving across borders. Similarly faded. Intact. Claire sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit with the panel resting across her knees. She sat there and thought about Marcus's grandfather, Otto Donovan, born 1925 in Stuttgart, who had arrived in the United States in 1951 at the age of 26 with a wife, a moderate amount of money, and whatever a family carried when it reconstituted itself in the years after a war. Marcus had mentioned him rarely and without detail. He'd left the family house in Denton and a modest cash inheritance. The estate had been settled quickly in 2014, and Claire had handled the paperwork herself. No artwork had been listed in that estate. No paintings had been disclosed, catalogued, or discussed. She set the panel aside on the nearest tote and stood up. Her hands were steadier than they should have been. She noticed that about herself with a detached kind of interest. There were 6 more crates in that row. She moved to the second one, the next in size. She undid the tape, removed the blanket. This crate held a canvas rather than a panel. She pulled the stretcher frame free of its foam, held it at the corners as she'd been trained, and turned it to face the light. Interior scene. A woman at a window. Northern European, compositionally, in the way Northern European painting had made ordinary domestic interiors into something else entirely, into prolonged meditations on light and time. The woman's face was turned away. Her hands rested on the windowsill. Behind her, a table held a blue ceramic jug and 2 other objects obscured by shadow. The paint surface carried the same depth as the panel, the same evidence of built layers, the same organic craquelure in the whites and the midtones. The light in the painting was the thing that stopped her. It came from the left, from beyond the visible edge of the frame, diffuse and cool and almost physically present, falling across the table and the wall and the woman's shoulders with that specific quality of northern light rendered through layers of translucent pigment. The subject was simple. A woman at a window. It had been a subject for painters for centuries and would continue to be one. What made it different from 1,000 other women at windows was the particular quality of attention paid to the light. The way the shadows under the table described the weight of the air in that room. The way the blue jug held a reflection that required a painter to understand, not merely observe, how light behaved on a glazed ceramic surface. Claire had seen this quality of attention before, in a handful of authenticated works she'd studied as a graduate student. In photographs of paintings that lived behind museum glass in Amsterdam, in New York, in the Mauritshuis collection in The Hague. She looked at this painting for what might have been 30 seconds, or what might have been 3 minutes. She could not accurately say. Then she turned the canvas over. On the back of the stretcher bar, in old ink applied in a deliberate and unhurried hand, someone had written a single word. It was not in German this time. It was in Dutch, a language she had spent 2 years reading in graduate school, in the documentation of post-war provenance cases, in auction house records and museum databases, and the yellowed correspondence of dealers who had handled works in the years between 1933 and 1945 and who had kept records of those transactions with varying degrees of accuracy and honesty. The word on the back of the stretcher bar was not a description of the subject or the medium or the date of acquisition. It was a name she recognized. The name of a painter who had lived in Delft in the 17th century. A painter whose authenticated works numbered in the low 30s worldwide, most of them in museums, a handful in private collections that had been documented and redocumented for generations. A painter whose name, even now, even in an age when art market records were tracked obsessively and cross-referenced by dozens of databases, could make a room go quiet when attached to an unknown work. The last authenticated canvas by this painter to come to public auction had sold in 2004 for $29. $3 million. Claire's hands did not shake. She had spent too many years in a profession that required steadiness in the face of discovery, and even though she'd left that profession 14 years ago, the steadiness remained. She held the canvas frame with both hands and looked at the word on the back and understood, in the particular way that understanding arrives when it has been building for a long time without permission, that she was not looking at a reproduction. She was not looking at a later copy by a student or follower. She was looking at something that had been in a climate-controlled storage unit in Dallas for 6 years, in a crate Marcus Donovan didn't remember renting, transported across whatever distance in whatever hands had carried it here from the Germany where Otto Donovan had been born in 1925 and from which he had fled in 1951. She set the canvas down carefully on top of the first tote, face upward, leaning against the shelving so nothing pressed against the paint surface. Then she looked at the 5 remaining crates. She had been standing in this unit for perhaps 40 minutes. She had not eaten since the cereal she'd had over the kitchen sink at 5:30 in the morning. She had drunk half a cup of coffee from the drive-thru on South Buckner that she'd finished before the auction started. She was aware of being cold, the particular cold that came from standing still in a concrete building in December, and she was aware of her heart rate, which had settled into something elevated but steady. A state she recognized from her years at the auction house when a work came in for assessment, and the first visual impression suggested something that couldn't quite be true, and you had to hold your professional composure long enough to make sure you weren't wrong. You had to make sure you weren't wrong. That was the thing. The thing you hoped for and the thing you feared were sometimes the same exact thing. A name written on the back of a stretcher bar meant nothing by itself. It could be a later attribution by a hopeful owner, a dealer's optimistic notation, a copyist's record of which painting they were reproducing, or pure fiction. The history of the art market was full of names written on the backs of things that had no legitimate claim to those names. The history of provenance was, in large part, the history of people wanting something to be worth more than it was. But the paintings she had looked at in the last 40 minutes did not look like they wanted to be something they weren't. They looked like what they were. The craquelure, the paint layer quality, the palette, the specific quality of depth that came from technique rather than reproduction. These were things she had been trained to read, and what she was reading was not encouraging her to be cautious. It was encouraging her to open the next crate. She picked up the third one. It was heavier than the first two, requiring both hands to lift it clear of the floor. She set it on the nearest tote and worked the packing tape off the seams, slower now, more deliberate, the way she'd been trained to handle anything whose value you suspected but couldn't yet confirm. Inside the foam was another canvas, larger than the second, perhaps 30 by 36 inches, the frame built from heavier wood. The stretcher bars older in their construction and reinforced at the corners with hand-cut wedges that were no longer standard practice. She lifted it free and turned it. The light from the open unit door fell across the surface, and she went completely still. 3 paintings in 3 crates. 3 paintings that looked, in every way her training had given her to read such things, like they had no business being in a storage unit on South Buckner Boulevard in Dallas. In the forgotten property of a man who had spent 11 years treating the person with the knowledge to understand what he owned as an afterthought. She thought about calling someone. She didn't know who. She thought about the phone in her coat pocket and the number for Hartley and Crane that she hadn't dialed in over a decade, about whether the firm even still existed, about what she would say. She thought about Dr. Hollis and their session 2 weeks from now, and about Daniel's Wednesday evening calls, and about her sister's voice asking, "How do you know there's anything worth looking at in there?" There were 4 more crates along the wall. She had 48 hours to clear this unit. She turned to the 4th crate and reached for the tape. The tape came away in one long strip, and she folded the moving blanket back, and she stood there for a moment before she even fully registered what she was looking at. The mind, she had learned, sometimes needed a second to catch up to what the eyes were already processing. This canvas was the largest so far. Horizontal rather than vertical, what painters called a landscape orientation, though the subject was not a landscape. It was figures, 2 of them. Indoor, Northern European again, the same diffuse left side light she'd seen in the interior from the 2nd crate. The same specificity of shadow. The same kind of presence in the paint surface that she had spent 3 years of her professional life learning to distinguish from the painted absence that reproductions carried. She did not turn this one over immediately. She just looked at it, the way she used to look at things before she spent 14 years not looking at them. She stood there in a storage unit in Dallas in December with her hands at her sides and her coat slightly open because she'd been working and had forgotten the cold, and she looked at a painting that had been in this room for 6 years in the dark, sealed in foam, waiting for more crates. 7 total. 2 paintings she'd already examined. This was the 3rd canvas. She turned it over. The back of the stretcher bar held 2 marks. The first was another custom seal, red, matching the one on the panel. The second was a notation in the same handwriting she'd seen on the 2nd canvas. Not a single word this time. 4 words in Dutch, written in that deliberate, unhurried hand. She read them slowly. Then she sat down on the concrete floor again, and she stayed there for a long time. And outside the storage facility, the December morning continued with complete indifference to what was happening inside Unit 4C. And somewhere across the city, Marcus Donovan was living the life his lawyer had built for him. And Claire Moreau sat on a concrete floor with a painting in her lap and began, for the first time in 11 months, to understand what the next year of her life might actually look like. The 4 words were not a painter's name. They were a family name, written in a different hand than the attribution on the 2nd canvas, smaller and less deliberate, as if added by someone who wanted the record to exist without drawing attention to it. Not the confident inscription of a collector cataloging his holdings. More like the notation of someone who needed to remember, or needed someone else to remember, in case they were not around to say it aloud. Family Hartmann, Amsterdam, 1938. Claire sat on the concrete floor of Unit 4C with the canvas resting across her knees and read those 4 words until they stopped being letters and started being what they were. A family, a city, a year. 2 years after the Nuremberg laws had been in effect long enough to reshape daily life throughout Germany and the occupied territories. 3 years before the Nazis began the systematic deportation of Dutch Jews from Amsterdam in coordinated waves that emptied entire neighborhoods in a matter of months. 1938 was not the worst year. It was the year before the worst years, which meant it was already inside them. She had written her graduate thesis on provenance recovery. She had spent 2 years reading the documentation of what had happened to privately held art collections in Europe between 1933 and 1945, the inventories made by the JRR, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the task force established specifically to seize cultural property from Jewish families and transport it to Germany. She had read case files from the Dutch Restitution Committee, from the Commission for Looted Art in Europe, from the ERR database that had been digitized and made publicly accessible in 2007. She had read testimony from heirs who had spent decades trying to prove that a painting in a museum or a private collection had once hung in their grandmother's house before men with authority had walked through the door and removed it. A family named Hartmann. Amsterdam. A date that placed them squarely in the years when everything they owned could be taken by law. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She opened the 5th crate standing. The canvas inside was the second landscape she'd seen, larger than the panel from the first crate, horizontal, perhaps 36 inches wide. Rolling terrain and a sky rendered in the layered way of the Flemish tradition, not Dutch exactly. Older, the technique slightly different from the interiors she'd examined. A different hand than the canvases she'd already seen. She turned it over. On the stretcher bar, in faded pencil, 2 lines. A title she couldn't make out through the grime. Below it, a number. An inventory number. She recognized the format, the kind assigned by a collection or institution, not by a private family. She set it down carefully and moved to the 6th crate. This one held something different. Not a canvas or a panel. When she pulled away the moving blanket, she found a wooden box approximately 14 inches square and perhaps 4 inches deep, sealed shut with small brass latches and lined, when she opened it, with velvet that had faded from deep green to gray. Inside, nestled in custom-cut depressions in a secondary foam layer, for medallions of worked gold, a small carved ivory figure perhaps 6 inches tall, and a leather-bound book whose cover was tooled with a design she couldn't identify in the limited light. Decorative arts. Another category entirely. Another category of things that had traveled across Europe in suitcases and trunks, and the hidden compartments of vehicles in the years when everything portable carried the risk of being the last thing a family had left. She held the ivory figure up to the light from the open door. The carving was exceptional, the detail in the face and hands and the folds of the garment at a level that spoke of a craftsman working slowly, with intention. It was old. She couldn't say how old, not without proper examination, but old in the way that objects accumulated a quality of seriousness that newer things didn't have, regardless of their material value. She placed it back in the velvet. She closed the box. The 7th crate was the largest. 4 feet wide, 3.5 feet tall, built heavier than the others with reinforced corner joints and additional padding at the top and bottom. She had to wrestle it upright to set it against the shelving and work the tape off the top seam while holding it steady with one knee. When she got the moving blanket away, she saw why it had been built heavier. The painting inside was mounted on panel, not canvas. Panel in that size was unusual, the kind of support that required the painter to work differently, the kind that was more demanding of climate stability because wood expanded and contracted more dramatically than canvas. This panel showed multiple figures, a domestic interior, 3 people in a room lit from a single window at left, the light falling with that specificity of attention she'd now seen 4 times. The craquelure across the surface was the most extensive she'd examined yet. The varnish had yellowed deeply, giving the surface an amber cast that would need to be removed before the underlying palette revealed itself fully. She didn't turn it over. She stood in front of it for a moment, looking, and then she turned it over. The back of the panel carried 3 marks, the custom seal in red, another inventory number in pencil, and an ownership stamp in ink that was more legible than most she'd seen that morning. She brought the panel close to the light and read it. The stamp was circular, with text around the outer ring and a symbol in the center. The text named a gallery. A Viennese gallery, from a name she recognized from her research, a dealer who had operated in Vienna and Amsterdam before and during the war years, and whose records had been partially reconstructed by researchers in the 1990s. A dealer whose inventory had included works from Jewish collections acquired under duress, works whose provenance had been the subject of restitution claims that were still, in some cases, unresolved. Claire set the panel down. She stepped back until she was standing in the center of the unit with all 7 open crates around her, and the paintings and the box arranged on the totes, and the shelving and the floor. 7 works, possibly more in the decorative box, all bearing marks that placed them in the stream of European art that had moved, with and without consent, during the most destructive period in the history of the continent. All stored here since 2017 in a climate-controlled unit rented by a man who had inherited them from his grandfather, who had been born in Stuttgart in 1925, who had left Germany in 1951, who had never spoken of any of it. She took out her phone and began photographing. Systematically, the way she'd been trained. Front of each work, back of each work, detail shots of each marking, each stamp, each inscription. The box from the 6th crate, open and closed. The inventory tags on the crates themselves. The labels on the totes, which were irrelevant but which she documented anyway, out of a habit of completeness that 14 years of warranty claims had not managed to erode. She used 143 photographs. She checked each one for focus before moving on. She documented the unit from the doorway, showing the general organization. She documented the climate control unit mounted high on the back wall. When she was finished, she stood in the doorway and looked at everything one more time. Then she closed the unit, engaged the combination lock Amy had given her, and walked back to the parking lot. She sat in the Civic for 11 minutes without starting the engine. The call center was closed for the day. She'd requested the day off. She had nowhere to be. She had 48 hours to clear the unit or arrange additional storage, which she was now going to do regardless of cost, because she was not moving anything until she had spoken to someone who understood what she was looking at. She drove back to Garland. She stopped at a drive-thru for coffee and a sandwich, eating both in the parking lot of the storage facility before she left, because she realized she needed to eat before she could think clearly, and she needed to think clearly before she did anything else. The drive took 40 minutes. She spent most of it rehearsing things she might say to people she hadn't spoken to in years. That night, at the small table in her kitchen with her laptop open and the photographs transferred to her desktop, Claire worked for 4.5 hours. She pulled up the Art Loss Register, the largest international database of stolen and looted cultural property, maintained in London and cross-referenced by over 200 contributing institutions worldwide. She pulled up the ERR Project database, the digitized records of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the Nazi task force that had seized art and cultural property across occupied Europe, whose inventories listed approximately 4 million objects confiscated from Jewish families, resistance members, and anyone else the regime designated as an enemy. She pulled up the Dutch Restitution Committee's case archive, the resource she'd used most in her graduate research, which documented claims submitted by heirs of Dutch families whose collections had been taken during the occupation. She pulled up the Commission for Looted Art in Europe's databases. She searched the name Hartmann alongside Amsterdam in 1938 and Dutch Golden Age and decorative arts and ivory, and every combination she could think of. She got 4 results for Hartmann that merited attention. One was a closed case from 2009, a landscape painting returned to a Hartmann heir from a German municipal museum after 30 years of negotiation. The painting in that case was Flemish, 17th century. She wrote down the case number and the gallery stamp associated with the case record. It matched the stamp on the 7th crate's panel. She sat very still for a moment after making that connection. The stamp was the same Viennese dealer. The same format. Not a match to the landscape that had been returned in 2009, because that case was closed and the work was accounted for. But from the same dealer's inventory, which meant the same chain of acquisition, which meant the same source. One was an open inquiry filed in 2018 by a law firm in Manhattan representing the estate of a Miriam Hartmann Goldstein, seeking information regarding approximately 12 works of art documented in a 1937 family inventory that had not been located since the family's forced departure from Amsterdam in 1941. She read that line 3 times. Forced departure in 1941, which was the year the systematic deportations from Amsterdam had begun in earnest, the year entire streets of Jewish families had been transported east with whatever they could carry on their backs, leaving behind everything else. She read the description of the missing works from the 1937 inventory. 2 listed as interiors, Dutch Golden Age, attributed provisionally to the workshop of Vermeer. 1 listed as a panel painting, figures, Dutch Golden Age. 1 as a landscape, Flemish School. 2 described as works on paper, likely lost. 3 decorative objects. Worked gold medallions described as Byzantine origin, an ivory figure, Flemish, circa 1680, and a bound manuscript in leather with tooled cover. Claire's hands were flat on the table. She was aware of her breathing. She looked at her photographs, then at the inventory, then at her photographs again. The ivory carving in her photographs was 6 inches tall, a figure in formal dress. The listing from the 1937 inventory described an ivory figure, religious subject, approximately 6 inches, Flemish, circa 1680. The 4 gold medallions in the velvet box. The inventory listed 4 worked gold medallions, possibly Byzantine, provenance unknown at time of inventory. She closed the laptop. Then she opened it again immediately because the instinct to close it was the instinct to not know. And she had spent 11 months not knowing things, and it had not served her well. She had to call someone. She needed a professional opinion before she could take any step that meant something. She was not a practicing appraiser. She had not held that credential in 14 years. What she had was graduate training, 3 years of professional experience, and 143 photographs on her laptop that she could not, on her own, turn into anything. She opened a new search and typed the name she'd been not typing for the last 3 hours. Elise Moreau, Fort Worth. Elise had been the senior appraiser at Hartley & Crane when Claire was a junior. She'd been in her late 40s then, a specialist in Northern European painting with a secondary expertise in provenance cases and restitution claims. The only person at the firm who'd read the same post-war documentation that Claire had read for her thesis. They'd worked 2 estate cases together before Claire left. They had not been in contact since. A search produced a current listing. Elise had left Hartley & Crane in 2015 and established an independent practice in Fort Worth. Her website was spare and professional, listing her specializations and affiliations, including a consultancy role with the International Foundation for Art Research. There was a contact form. Claire typed an email at 11:47 p.m. She kept it factual. She identified herself, explained that they'd worked together briefly at Hartley & Crane over a decade ago, said she'd come into possession of several works that appeared to require professional assessment, that she had reason to believe the provenance was complex, and that she would appreciate a conversation at Elise's earliest convenience. She sent it before she could revise it into something more cautious. She went to bed at 12:30. She lay in the dark listening to the parking lot outside and thinking about a family named Hartmann in Amsterdam in 1938 and a man named Otto Donovan, who had been born in Stuttgart in 1925 and who had left Germany in 1951 and who had told his grandson nothing. She slept for 4 hours. The call from the unknown number came at 9:14 the following morning. She was still at the table in her kitchen with coffee and her laptop when the phone rang. A 817 area code she didn't recognize. Ms. Moreau. A woman's voice, brisk and precise. This is Elise Moreau. I received your email last night. I have questions. Claire had not expected a call. She had expected, if anything, a careful email reply sometime in the following week. Thank you for calling. You said complex provenance. What does that mean in this context? Before you answer, I should tell you that I've spent the last 25 years doing almost nothing but complex provenance cases. So complex means different things to different people, and I'd rather know what you mean specifically. Claire told her. All of it, in the order it happened. The storage unit, the auction, the paintings, the marks on the backs of the works, the inventory notation from 1938, the 4 words on the 4th canvas. She sent the photographs while she talked, watching the delivery confirmation appear on her screen. Elise was quiet for a moment after Claire finished. You said 2 interiors. Dutch Golden Age. What was the quality of the paint surface? Deep layered buildup. Organic craquelure throughout. Varied distribution. Consistent with age rather than manufactured. The yellowing of the varnish was uniform. The light source in the interiors. Describe it. Left side. Diffuse, not direct. The shadows under the table in the second one described the weight of the air in a way that required a painter who understood light physically, not just observed it. Another silence. The attribution on the stretcher bar. You're sure of what you read? I've looked at the photograph 6 times this morning. All right, Elise said. She said it the way people said it when they met. This is going to be larger than you expect. I have 2 appointments this week I can't move. I can come to Dallas on Thursday. Where's the unit? Claire gave her the address. Don't move anything, Elise said. Don't let anyone else into the unit. And Ms. Moreau, is the person who rented this unit aware that you've won it at auction? Not as far as I know. Keep it that way as long as you can. Once he knows, the situation will become complicated quickly. She ended the call without pleasantries, which was consistent with how Claire remembered her. She turned to the 4th crate and reached for the tape. It was heavier than the first 2, requiring both hands to lift it from the floor. She set it on the nearest tote and worked the packing tape off the seams carefully. Inside the foam was another canvas, larger than the second, perhaps 30 by 36 inches. She lifted it free and turned it. The light from the open unit door fell across the surface, and she went completely still. 3 paintings in 3 crates. All of them bearing the quality of presence she'd been trained to look for and had learned not to mistake for anything less than what it was. She set this 3rd canvas down beside the others and looked at them together, 3 rectangles of painted light and shadow that had traveled across decades and borders and one man's deliberate silence, and she thought about Marcus's parting words on Tuesday evening. When you find out what those things are worth and what they're connected to, you're going to be in a situation you're not equipped to handle alone. She had heard the warning in that sentence when he said it. She was hearing something else in it now. He had known. Not the full detail, perhaps, not every mark and inscription and provenance connection that her training had allowed her to read. But he had known enough. He had known these were not office files and broken equipment. He had rented this unit 3 years after his grandfather's death, which meant he had found them in the estate, and he had moved them here, and he had paid the storage fees for 6 years until a canceled credit card and 6 months of delinquency notices broke the chain. He had not told her. He had not disclosed them in the divorce. He had not listed them as assets in any proceeding. He had let the unit go and trusted that it would stay invisible. And for a few more months it might have, except that the facility's emergency contact form still had her name on it. And she had not deleted the email. She spent another hour opening the remaining crates. The 5th held a landscape, the 6th the wooden box with the gold medallions and ivory figure and the leather-bound manuscript she hadn't opened yet. The 7th held the large panel with multiple figures. 7 works. Possibly 8 or 9 if the manuscript counted separately from the decorative objects. She photographed everything a second time, more carefully, with better light and more deliberate framing. Then she locked the unit and drove back to Garland and began the night that would change the shape of everything that came after. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Marcus found out on Tuesday. Claire didn't know how. Later, she would piece it together. The auction facility's records were technically public under Texas Property Code, and Marcus's name remained on the original rental agreement. Someone at his new property management company had run a routine records sweep and found the delinquency flag refiled with the county when the auction cleared. Or perhaps one of the resellers who'd been at the auction had mentioned it to someone. Dallas was a large city that operated, in certain professional circles, like a smaller one. He called her mobile number at 6:47 p.m. on Tuesday. She was standing in the kitchen eating crackers over the sink because she hadn't had enough appetite to cook and hadn't wanted to admit that by sitting down at the table. She answered, "I need to know what's in that storage unit." No preamble. That was Marcus. He'd always moved straight to the point of things, which she'd once admired and had since reinterpreted as an unwillingness to acknowledge that other people in the conversation might require transition time. "Good evening, Marcus." "Claire." The warning note in his voice was familiar. She'd heard it across the kitchen table on Sunday mornings when she raised topics he'd rather not engage. Across conference calls with the accountant when she pointed out numbers that didn't resolve themselves neatly. The unit on South Buckner was mine. The rental was in your name, she said, before you allowed it to go 6 months delinquent and the facility auctioned the contents under Texas Property Code Section 59, which you were notified of as account holder. I didn't receive notification. The facility sent it to the contact information on your rental agreement. Whatever happened to it after that isn't something I can speak to. He was quiet for a moment. With Marcus, quiet usually meant recalibrating. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I'm learning. Those things are not yours. They were never meant to be. You need to understand that. She had thought about this specific moment during the drive back to Garland on Tuesday. She'd run through several versions of how it might go and had settled on simple. Marcus, I bought that unit at a public auction. The contents are legally mine. If you believe otherwise, your attorney can explain to my attorney why that position doesn't hold under Texas law. She paused. Was there anything else? He said one more thing before she ended the call. He said it quietly, which was worse than if he'd said it at volume, because it was the voice he used when he was confident rather than performing confidence. He said, when you find out what those things are worth and what they're connected to, you're going to be in a situation you're not equipped to handle alone. She ended the call. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that about herself with a particular kind of attention. His attorney called her own number, the same woman who had handled the divorce, at 9:15 the following morning. The attorney explained that Marcus was asserting a claim to the contents of the unit on the grounds that they had been placed there in the context of a business relationship predating the marriage, and that their removal and sale, without his knowledge or consent, represented a potential breach of property disclosure requirements under Texas Family Code. The language was careful and professional and meant to intimidate through complexity. Claire wrote it all down on a notepad without comment. When the attorney finished, Claire said, the unit was not disclosed in any property documentation during the divorce proceedings. The auction was conducted lawfully under Texas Property Code. If Mr. Donovan believes he has a claim, he's welcome to file it. She called a different attorney that afternoon, not the one who'd handled the divorce, who she'd lost faith in somewhere around the 4th month of proceedings. A property attorney she'd found through the State Bar Referral Service, a woman in Plano named Veronica Sloan, who charged $250 an hour and who, when Claire explained the situation in a 15-minute intake call, said 3 things in succession that made Claire's chest loosen slightly. First, Texas Property Code Section 59 was unambiguous. A storage unit sold at public auction transferred all rights to the buyer upon payment. There was no recovery mechanism for the prior tenant outside of a showing of procedural fraud, which did not apply here. Marcus's claim was, as a technical matter, worth approximately nothing. Second, the question of the contents of the unit was separate from the question of who owned the unit. If the contents included items with disputed legal ownership, she said this carefully, with professional precision, that was a different analysis requiring different expertise. Third, Claire should not speak to Marcus or his attorney again without Veronica Sloan on the call. Claire paid the initial retainer from her savings account, which took the balance below $4,000 for the first time since the divorce settlement had cleared, and tried not to think about that number. She called her sister on Wednesday evening. Donna answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. News traveled through family the way it traveled through small towns, and Claire's mother had called Donna after Claire had called their mother, and now Donna was ready with questions she'd organized into an order of apparent casualness that didn't fool Claire for a moment. Mom said you found something at the storage unit. I found several things. What kind of things? Paintings. And some objects. Decorative arts. A pause. Like valuable paintings? Claire considered how to explain what she'd found to a person whose relationship to art was the prints her interior designer had selected for the hallway in Allen. I don't know yet. I'm having them assessed on Thursday by a specialist. How valuable is not knowing yet? Donna, I'm asking because you sound different than you have in months, and I want to understand what's happening. Claire sat at her kitchen table with her phone and looked at the photographs open on her laptop screen. The interior with the woman at the window. The light coming in from the left. The 4 Dutch words on the back of the stretcher bar. I found paintings that may have been in a collection in Amsterdam before the Second World War, she said. I found marks suggesting they passed through channels that are documented in looted art databases. I found what appears to be an inventory connection to a Jewish family whose works were never accounted for after they fled the Nazi occupation in 1941. The silence on Donna's end lasted long enough that Claire checked to make sure the call was still connected. "My God," Donna said finally. "Yes. How did Marcus have them?" "His grandfather, Otto Donovan, born in Stuttgart in 1925. He brought things with him when he emigrated in 1951. Things he stole? I don't know that. Not yet. Otto was 6 years old in 1931. He was 20 when the war ended. People who left Germany in the early 1950s carried all kinds of things, some of which they acquired legitimately, some of which they acquired in circumstances that were not legitimate, and some of which they found or inherited without full knowledge of what they were receiving." She paused. "I'm not making excuses for anyone. I'm saying the history is complicated and I don't know it yet." Donna was quiet again. "Then, what does this mean for you legally?" "I own the unit. The paintings are mine under Texas law. What happens after that depends on what they are and whether there are documented heirs with a restitution claim." "Could you lose them, even after buying them legally?" "I don't know. That's what Thursday is for." "Claire." Her sister's voice had changed. The careful quality was still there, but underneath it something else, the voice Donna used when she was genuinely trying to get past her own assumptions. "I told you not to go. I know. I was wrong. You were being reasonable. You didn't have the information." "Neither did you." "No," Claire said. "But I had a feeling." Donna didn't have an immediate response to that, which was, in its own way, a form of acknowledgement. Thursday arrived cold and clear. Claire had arranged to meet Elise at the storage facility at 10, having called ahead to confirm the unit would be accessible and to extend her storage arrangement by 2 weeks at her own expense. An additional $180 she put on a credit card without dwelling on it. Elise Moreau arrived in a gray sedan and stepped out wearing a coat Claire would have described as the coat of someone who spent their professional life in rooms where temperature and presentation both mattered. She was in her early 60s now, her hair white at the temples and cut short, her manner carrying the same quality it had at Hartley and Crane, contained, deliberate, the economy of someone who had learned that professional composure was its own form of communication. She looked at Claire for a moment without speaking, the way she used to look at a work before she'd made up her mind about it. "You look different than I remember," Elise said. 14 years. Not just that. She said it as if she saw something specific and had chosen not to elaborate. "Show me." They walked to Unit 4C without small talk. Claire opened the combination lock and raised the door. Elise stepped inside and stood in the center of the space for a full minute without touching anything or opening her case. Just looking. The way Claire had looked on Thursday, and the way her old supervisor had taught her to look, the initial encounter with a work unmediated by instruments, letting the eye do what the eye could do before the tools introduced their own vocabulary. Then Elise opened her case and began. She started with the second canvas, the interior with the woman at the window, the one with the attribution on the stretcher bar. She examined the front with a 10x loop first, working systematically from the upper left, following the order that appraisers used when they wanted to cover a surface without missing sections. Then she propped the canvas on the tote and positioned her portable UV lamp, angling it across the surface and watching how the varnish responded. Under UV, old varnish fluoresced unevenly, the natural resin darkening in a way that synthetic varnishes applied in the 20th century did not replicate. Areas of later restoration showed as darker patches against the general fluorescence, and their distribution could indicate whether a work had been significantly repainted or merely cleaned. On the second canvas, the UV distribution was consistent with a work whose surface had been untouched for a very long time. No obvious areas of overpainting. The varnish layer was thick and even in a way that indicated it had been applied in one period rather than built up through multiple later interventions. Elise did not speak while she worked. That was consistent with how Claire remembered her. After 20 minutes on the second canvas, she moved to the large panel from the 7th crate, and the examination grew longer and more careful. She spent nearly 30 minutes on the panel, which was the most complex surface she'd examined, the craquelure running deeper and in more varied patterns than the canvases, the underlying wood responding differently to the UV light. She photographed the gallery stamp on the back with her own camera, a better device than Claire's phone, and cross-referenced something on her tablet with the expression of someone finding a match they had not expected to find. Her posture shifted slightly, the contained professional readiness pulling a degree tighter. After the panel, she looked at the first landscape, then at the decorative box, examining each gold medallion under the loupe and photographing the maker's marks on the reverse. She handled the ivory figure for several minutes, tilting it at multiple angles, and whatever she saw in the grain and the tooling made her set it back in the velvet with particular care. She spent 2 hours and 17 minutes in the unit. Claire stood near the door and watched without asking questions. The blue totes labeled files 2015 to 2016, and Office Misc looked increasingly incongruous next to what surrounded them. When Elise finally straightened from the last examination and put her loupe away, she turned to face Claire with an expression that was not the blank professional face she'd worn throughout. It was the expression of someone who had just had an experience they were still organizing into language. "Tell me exactly how you came to own this unit," Elise said. Claire told her again. All of it, the same account she'd given on the phone, this time with Elise listening with the particular attention of someone preparing to build a structure from what they were hearing. "And you have no prior relationship with the former tenant of this unit?" "He's my ex-husband." Elise absorbed this. "You were married to the grandson of Otto Donovan for 11 years. And during those 11 years, no works of art were ever disclosed, discussed, or visible in the shared household. Nothing that would have indicated this." Claire paused. There was one painting in the house, a Western landscape print his grandmother had owned. Nothing that would have suggested he knew about any of this. "He may not have known," Elise said. "The grandfather may have stored these here himself, before his death in 2014, and Marcus may have moved them from wherever they were previously stored to this unit sometime after he inherited the estate. Without examining the estate records, I can't say." The unit was rented in March 2017, 3 years after Otto's death, which suggests Marcus was aware of them at some point, or someone acting on his behalf. Claire held that thought. Marcus, who had never mentioned art, who had bought charity auction pieces because a bare wall looked unfinished, who had let a storage unit go 6 months delinquent, either because he'd forgotten it or because he'd decided to let it go. She had spent 7 years keeping his accounts. She would not have known about a cash rental payment. "What are they?" she asked. Elise looked at her steadily. "I need to conduct further analysis. I need to consult attribution databases and compare against reference photographs of documented works. I need to review the provenance documentation more carefully, particularly the Viennese gallery stamp and the ERR inventory numbers. I am not prepared to give you a final assessment today." "I understand that. I'm asking what your preliminary assessment is." A pause. Elise picked up her case and carried it to the unit's threshold, setting it down outside. Then she turned back. "The second canvas, the interior with the figure at the window, is the most significant of what you have here. If it is what the inscription suggests, and if the attribution holds under full analysis, you are looking at a work that has not appeared in any public record since 1941. A work that the international art community has classified as missing." She paused again. "The last authenticated painting by that artist, too. Come to market, sold in 2004 for $29 million. The market for that work now, given scarcity, given the cultural significance of a rediscovery, given the provenance complexity that would follow authentication, would be." "I'm not able to give you a number. I'm not sure anyone could." Claire stood with her back against the shelving and looked at the woman at the window in the second canvas, the light falling from the left side of a room in 17th century Delft, falling across a table and a blue jug, and said nothing. "The other works are significant independently," Elise continued. "The panel from Crate 7 is likely from the same period and region, possibly the same workshop, though it requires its own full attribution analysis. The Flemish landscape is the kind of work that generates serious specialist interest at auction. The quality is there. The decorative objects are harder to assess without removal and controlled examination, but the ivory figure is exceptional. The worked gold medallions have the character of Byzantine origin, which if confirmed puts them in a category of extreme rarity. Even without the principal interior, the remaining works in this unit represent a collection of substantial value." She paused. "If everything authenticates, the total collection value could exceed $100 million under current market conditions." I want to be careful with that number because it depends on a great deal I haven't confirmed. But it is not an unreasonable range to hold in mind. Claire stood with her back against the shelving. $100 million. She had $3,800 in her savings account. She was 4 months behind on the timeline that ended with not being able to cover rent. She had bought a storage unit for $25 because she had a feeling, the kind of feeling that her sister had described as desperate, and that had turned out to be something else entirely. And the Hartmann notation? Elise's expression shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate. That changes the analysis considerably. If these works connect to the open restitution inquiry I found in the IFAR database from 2018, there are documented heirs who have been searching for them for decades. A family whose collection was seized in Amsterdam in 1941 and never recovered. She picked up her case. You purchased these legally, Ms. Moreau. I'm not disputing that. But what you purchased legally may belong, morally and possibly legally, to people who lost everything and have spent their lives trying to get it back. The storage corridor was quiet around them. A light breeze moved through the open end of a row of units. I know, Claire said. Elise studied her. You knew before I told you. I read about the inquiry on Monday night. I read the inventory from 1937. I cross-referenced the descriptions. She looked at the unit, at the 7 crates, at the phone-lined box in the 6th crate, at the 4 gold medallions that might have sat in a family's home in Amsterdam until men with authority came through the door. I need to know who the heirs are. I can find them. The 2018 inquiry lists a law firm in New York representing the estate. A woman named Hartmann who died in 2021 at the age of 91. She spent 60 years looking for these paintings. Elise paused. Her daughter is still alive. There are grandchildren. Claire closed the unit and engaged the lock. She stood with her back to the orange metal door and looked at the narrow sky between the rows of storage buildings, the flat December light offering nothing. She thought about Miriam Hartmann Goldstein, who had died in 2021 at the age of 91, having never found the things her family lost in 1941, who had filed an inquiry in 2018 through a New York law firm, which meant she had still been looking in her late 80s, still hoping, still writing letters and making calls and refusing to let the record remain incomplete. She thought about what it cost to keep looking that long. She thought about 11 months of a fold-out couch in Garland, which was a different and considerably lesser thing, but which had given her some understanding of what it felt like when the version of your life you expected stopped being available and you had to decide what you were willing to do instead. There's something else, Elise said. She had been looking at Claire with the expression of someone forming a judgment they hadn't expected to form. If these works are authenticated, and if their provenance connects to a documented restitution case, there are 2 paths forward. You can pursue ownership on the basis of your legal purchase of the unit, which will result in protracted litigation, because the heirs will challenge any claim, and because the international legal framework for looted art restitution, while not uniformly binding in Texas courts, creates significant complexity. She paused. Or you can contact the heirs directly, ahead of any legal process, and initiate a different kind of conversation. What kind of conversation? One that doesn't begin with lawyers. Claire looked at the locked unit. She thought about Marcus, who had called her at 6:47 p.m. 2 days ago demanding to know what was in there, who had sent an attorney the following morning, who had not, in 11 years of marriage, told her that his grandfather had emigrated from Germany carrying things that didn't belong to him, who had, through 7 years of letting her run his books and raise his son and manage the connective tissue of their shared life, allowed her to believe they were building something together, when what they were doing was building something for him. She thought about what it would mean to walk away from the largest thing that had ever been handed to her by accident. She thought about a woman in her late 80s filing an inquiry in 2018, still looking. Can you find the daughter? Claire said. The daughter of Miriam Hartmann Goldstein? By the end of the week. Find her. Elise nodded once and picked up her case. She walked toward the parking lot with the brisk efficiency of someone who had work to do and intended to do it. Claire stood in the storage corridor alone. The December air sat still around her. Somewhere on South Buckner Boulevard a truck changed gears, and the sound carried in the way sounds carried in cold air, clear and slightly strange. She had $25 worth of legal claim to what was inside Unit 4C. She had a property attorney who had already been paid a retainer. She had a husband's former attorney circling from the opposite direction with a claim that had no legal foundation but would cost time and money to rebuff. And she had the name of a woman she'd never met whose mother had spent 60 years looking for things that were behind a locked orange door in Dallas, Texas. She had about 1 week before the situation became impossible to manage alone. She drove back to Garland, picked up a shift report she'd missed at the call center, apologized by email to Terrence for the disruption to the week, and made dinner. While she ate, she opened her laptop and looked at the photographs again, all 143 of them, in order, the way she'd been trained to look at evidence in sequence rather than in isolation. Daniel called at 8:30. She answered without thinking, the Wednesday call arriving on its usual schedule regardless of what was happening in her life, which was in its own way a comfort. "Hey, Mom." "Hey, you okay? You sound different." She thought about how to answer that. She was sitting at a kitchen table in Garland with her ex-husband's forgotten storage unit contents photographed on her laptop screen, which included what appeared to be several works of art whose combined value, according to the most conservative reading of what Elise had told her, would require a number she hadn't yet let herself fully form. She had $3,800 left in savings. She had a call center shift at 6 a.m. on Friday. She had been asked to help find the daughter of a woman who had died at 91, still looking for the things a family had lost in 1941. "I had an unusual week," she said. "What happened? I'll tell you when I know more. It's still in progress." Daniel was quiet for a moment, which was the thing he did when he was deciding how hard to push. He'd inherited that from her side. "Okay, but you're okay?" "I think so. Actually, yes. I think I am." After the call, she sat at the table for a long time without looking at the laptop. She thought about what Elise had said at the end of their conversation in the storage corridor. One path forward or another. Lawyers or a different kind of conversation. The question was not really a legal one. The legal question was already partially answered, and Veronica Sloan would answer the rest of it. The real question was the one that had been forming since Monday night, when she'd read about Miriam Hartmann Goldstein and her daughter, and the 1937 inventory, and the inquiry filed in 2018 at the age of 88, still looking. Claire had spent 11 months learning what it cost to have things taken from you, what it did to the specific structure of a life when the things you'd built and held and counted on were removed by someone with more legal leverage than you had. She'd learned it in ways that were small and ordinary compared to what a family in Amsterdam in 1941 had learned. She was aware of that difference. She wasn't going to pretend it was equivalent. But she understood, in a way she might not have understood a year ago, what it meant for something to remain unresolved, for a gap to exist where something should be, for the record to stay incomplete. The woman at the window looked out at the same light she'd been looking at for 400 years. The blue jug held the same reflection. The shadow under the table described the same weight of air. She closed the laptop and washed her dish and went to bed. She had about 1 week before the situation became impossible to manage alone. She was going to use every hour of it. Marcus had said she wasn't equipped to handle this alone. He'd said it quietly, in the voice that meant confidence rather than threat. And he'd been right that it was large. He'd been right that it was complicated. What he'd miscalculated, in the way that people miscalculated when they'd spent years seeing a person as a supporting role in their own story, was the particular combination of things Claire Moreau carried with her. 7 years of knowing his financial architecture. A master's degree in the specific history that made these objects significant. 3 years of professional experience in the room where these objects were assessed, documented, and returned to their proper context. And 11 months of learning, the hard way, that she was more capable of managing alone than anyone, including herself, had previously understood. She closed the laptop. She washed her dish. She went to bed. Outside the parking lot of the Garland apartment building, December held the city in its flat grip. The orange streetlight threw its ordinary light over the ordinary cars and the ordinary pavement and the particular silence of an hour when most people were asleep and the night had no more events to offer. Claire lay in the dark on the fold-out couch and did not sleep for a long time. She was thinking about Miriam Hartmann Goldstein, who had been born in Amsterdam in 1930 and who had died in New York in 2021 at 91, having spent 6 decades in a country she hadn't chosen, looking for the things her family had left behind when they fled a country that had stopped being safe. She was thinking about a leather-bound manuscript in a velvet-lined box and a woman at a window, and a blue jug holding the light of an afternoon 400 years gone. She was thinking about what it meant to be the person who happened to find something that had been lost by someone else. What you owed to that coincidence. What it asked of you. The law had one answer. She was beginning to understand that she had a different one. Elise sent the contact information on a Friday morning at 8:43 a.m. A single email with no preamble. A name, Rachel Goldsteinberg. An address in Park Slope, Brooklyn. A phone number with a 718 area code. Below that, 2 sentences. She is 65 years old and teaches art history at Pratt Institute. She has been waiting for this call her entire adult life. Claire read the email 4 times at the kitchen table before she made coffee. Then she made coffee and read it again. She had a shift at the call center at 6 that morning and had worked it, sitting with her headset on, apologizing to a man in Baton Rouge about his malfunctioning dryer and a woman in Portland about a refrigerator whose ice maker had stopped working in November, which the woman pointed out was the worst possible time for that to happen. Claire had agreed. She'd processed the claims, filed the notes, said goodbye, and have a good day with the same measured warmth she applied to every call. And then she'd driven home and made eggs and sat at the table and opened her laptop and found the email from Elise waiting. Rachel Goldsteinberg. Art History. Pratt Institute. Miriam Hartmann Goldstein's daughter had become an art historian. Claire sat with that for a moment. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She called at 10:30, after she'd been through what she wanted to say twice more in her head and understood that no amount of preparation was going to make this a simple conversation. The phone rang 4 times. Then a woman's voice, careful and precise, the voice of someone accustomed to being careful. Hello, Ms. Goldsteinberg. My name is Claire Moreau. I'm calling from Dallas, Texas. I was given your contact information by an appraiser named Elise Moreau, who I believe may have been in touch with your family's law firm. A pause. Short but complete, the kind of pause that holds a lot of breath. Yes, Rachel said. Mr. Fenwick called me yesterday. He said there might be news. There is news. I want to be straightforward with you about what I know and what I don't know yet. I found a storage unit at a public auction in Dallas that I believe contains works that match your family's 1937 inventory. I've had a preliminary assessment from a specialist who confirms several of the works are consistent with the descriptions in the restitution inquiry your mother filed in 2018. The silence this time was longer. How many works? Rachel's voice had not changed in its quality of control, but something underneath it had shifted. 7 pieces in total, plus a box of decorative objects. 2 interiors, I believe, are Dutch Golden Age. A panel painting, figures. A Flemish landscape. 3 more works whose attribution is still being confirmed. She paused. There's an ivory figure. For worked gold medallions. A leather-bound manuscript I haven't opened. She heard Rachel exhale. A sound that was not quite crying and not quite relief and not quite either of those things, but something that existed before either of them. In the moment before your body knows what it's going to do with information it has been waiting 60 years to receive. My mother described the ivory figure to me when I was a child, Rachel said. She said it was from Antwerp, that her grandmother kept it on a shelf in the front room. She could describe exactly which shelf. Her voice remained steady, but only in the way that took visible effort. She described it to me so that I would remember it, so that if it was ever found, someone in the family would know it. Claire held the phone and said nothing for a moment. Outside her kitchen window, the December sky was the same flat gray it had been for 2 weeks. A car alarm sounded briefly 2 blocks away and then stopped. I'd like to send you photographs, Claire said. Everything I have. And I'd like to talk to you about what comes next. I don't want to have this conversation through lawyers. Neither do I. The steadiness in Rachel's voice had become something different. Still precise, still controlled, but warmer now, more present. Ms. Moreau, why are you calling me? You purchased the unit legally. You could have done any number of other things. I know, Claire said. I'm calling because it's the right thing to do. She sent the photographs within the hour. All 143 of them, plus the additional ones she'd taken on a second visit to the unit 3 days earlier after she'd purchased a better phone camera for the specific purpose. She labeled each one carefully, matching them where she could to the descriptions in the 1937 inventory. The ivory figure, Flemish, circa 1680. The 4 medallions in their velvet depressions. The woman at the window with the blue jug and the light from the left side of a room in Delft. Rachel called back at 3:15 that afternoon. Her voice was different. It had the quality of someone who had been crying and had stopped, but hadn't moved very far from it. The ivory figure, she said. The right hand. Is there a small nick in the base of the right hand, near the wrist? Claire enlarged the photograph on her laptop. She looked at the base of the carved hand. The nick was there, a small imperfection. In the ivory, as if something had caught it at some point in its history and left a mark. Yes, Claire said. The sound Rachel made then was not words. It was the sound of 65 years of waiting arriving all at once in a Brooklyn kitchen on a Friday afternoon in December. Claire waited until it passed. She didn't fill the silence with anything. She just let it be what it was. They talked for 2 hours. Rachel told her about Miriam, who had been 11 years old when the family left Amsterdam, who had spent the rest of a long life in Queens, and then in Manhattan, and then in a retirement apartment on the Upper West Side, who had kept the 1937 inventory in a folder in her filing cabinet and had updated the contact information on the restitution inquiry every time the law firm changed addresses, who had said to Rachel when she was 8 years old, sitting at a kitchen table in Queens over a bowl of soup, "There are things from our family that are still out there. When they come back, they'll need someone who knows them." That was why she described the ivory figure. That was why she went through the inventory with Rachel every few years, the way other families went through photo albums. So the memory would stay specific. So when it arrived, if it arrived, someone would be ready. Miriam had taught herself to use a computer at the age of 84 for the specific purpose of submitting updated documentation to the art loss register. Rachel had sat beside her at the desk and shown her how to attach files to an email. Her mother had said, while they were doing this, that she understood she was probably not going to live to see the paintings come back, but she wanted to make sure the trail stayed warm. That was how she put it. Keep the trail warm, so whoever came after her would know where to look. She had filed the updated inquiry in 2018 at the age of 88 using Rachel's email address because she didn't trust her own. She had died in the spring of 2021, still believing the works would eventually be found. She had told Rachel in one of their last conversations that she'd been doing the math and the paintings were still out there somewhere, because things like that didn't simply stop existing. They waited. Eventually, someone with the right eyes would find them. Claire listened to all of this. She told Rachel her own version of the last 2 weeks in the same straightforward way she'd started the conversation, because Rachel asked, and because the story deserved to be told honestly from both directions. She told her about the call center, about the $40, about her sister's voice telling her it was probably old tools. She told her about the smell of linseed oil in the storage unit, about the light in the second canvas and the 30 seconds she'd stood in front of it before she understood what she was looking at. Rachel was quiet for a moment after Claire finished. Then she said, "My mother would have liked you." "I hope so," Claire said. She had a strong feeling about people who paid attention. She said it was the rarest quality. You paid attention. By the end of the call, they had agreed on 2 things. First, that the formal authentication process would proceed through Elise's connections with Christie's and the IFAR, who would bring in the additional expertise required. Second, that whatever legal and financial arrangements came out of that process, they would negotiate directly, with their attorneys present but not leading, because both of them had seen what happened when lawyers led. After she hung up, Claire sat at the kitchen table for a long time doing nothing. She had told Marcus she was learning. She had not known, when she said that, how much she was going to have to learn before the month was out. The authentication results from Christie's came in 3 weeks after Elise made the referral. The specialist who traveled from New York was a man named Dr. Alan Firth, Senior Director of Old Master Paintings at Christie's Americas, who arrived in Dallas in a wool overcoat and examined the 7 works in Unit 4C over 2 full days with a team that included a conservator and a technical imaging specialist who brought equipment capable of producing X-ray and infrared reflectography scans of each canvas and panel. The equipment revealed the underdrawing beneath the paint layers, the way the artist had laid out the composition before applying pigment, which was in some cases more diagnostic than the finished surface. Dr. Firth was not a man given to strong language. He spent 2 days examining, photographing, scanning, and consulting databases on a laptop that he positioned facing away from everyone else in the room. And at the end of the second day, he sat down with Claire and Elise and Veronica Sloan, who Claire had asked to be present, and he said the following. The interior with the woman at the window was, in his professional opinion, a work consistent in every technically verifiable respect with the authenticated body of work produced by the named artist. The underdrawing revealed a compositional process identical to that observed in 3 authenticated works in European museum collections. The pigment analysis showed material consistent with 17th-century Dutch practice. The provenance documentation, including the gallery stamp and the family inscription, was consistent with the documented movement of works seized from Amsterdam collections during the occupation. Full authentication would require peer review, which would take months, and the completed provenance documentation would require legal processing through international restitution channels. But his preliminary opinion, which he was prepared to put in writing, was that the work was authentic. He said similar things, with varying degrees of confidence, about the other 6 works. He said that the total collection, if all attributions held through formal authentication, represented the most significant recovery of looted Dutch Golden Age paintings since the Austrian government returned the Rothschild collection in 1999. Claire sat in the storage unit on a folding chair Veronica had brought and listened to Dr. Firth speak, and understood that the number Elise had mentioned, the one she'd been careful not to fully form in her mind, was not an exaggeration. Marcus's injunction was filed the following week, 14 days after Dr. Firth's assessment, which suggested his attorney had found out about Christie's involvement and understood what it meant. The filing argued that the contents of Unit 4C constituted assets that should have been disclosed during the divorce proceedings and that their exclusion represented a material omission under Texas Family Code Section 7001, which required full disclosure of all property held by either spouse at the time of the divorce. Veronica Sloan called Claire the same afternoon the filing came through. He's arguing that the paintings were marital property you were entitled to during the divorce settlement, Veronica said. Her tone carried the dry specificity of someone laying out a problem they've already solved, which is an interesting position, given that he's the one who failed to disclose them. Can he make that argument? He can make it. He won't prevail. The unit was in his name. He paid for it from his accounts. He had exclusive access to it. Any court is going to look at the disclosure failure and determine that it sits with him, not with you. The fact that you purchased it at a subsequent public auction through a lawful process under Texas Property Code is an independent transaction that cuts against his claim in every direction. She paused. Additionally, there's a complication he hasn't fully accounted for. If the authentication holds and the works trace to a documented restitution case, the question of their ownership becomes a federal and international matter that supersedes any Texas divorce proceeding entirely. He's trying to stake a claim to something that, depending on how the restitution process resolves, he may never have had any right to in the first place. Because his grandfather took them. We don't know the full circumstances of how Otto Donovan acquired these works. That's for the historical investigation to determine. What we know is that a family named Hartmann has a documented inventory from 1937 showing these objects in their possession, and that the next documented appearance of the works is in this storage unit in 2017. Whatever happened between those 2 dates is the question that matters. And that question, Ms. Moreau, is above Marcus Donovan's pay grade. The injunction was denied 6 weeks later by a Dallas County District Court judge who found, in a written ruling, that the plaintiff had not established a cognizable claim to property that he had failed to disclose in prior proceedings and that had subsequently transferred to a good-faith purchaser through lawful auction. The ruling was 4 pages. The relevant section was 2 sentences. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Marcus called her the afternoon the ruling came out. She let it go to voicemail. She listened to the message once and then deleted it without replaying it. She had not been surprised by the call. She had been surprised by how little it affected her, the way certain things you have been dreading turn out, when they arrive, to be smaller than the weight you've been carrying in anticipation of them. Marcus was angry. She could hear that in the voice on the message, and he was frightened, which she could also hear, in the particular way that men who'd spent their lives being certain of things sounded when the certainty stopped holding. She understood those feelings without having any particular response to them. She had other things to think about. She and Rachel had spoken 6 times in the 6 weeks since the first phone call. The conversations had lengthened and changed in register, moving from the careful formal exchange of 2 people managing a situation to something that felt more like 2 people who were in the same story and had started to understand that. Rachel had sent her photographs. Miriam as a young woman in Amsterdam before the war, formal portrait style, standing in what Rachel described as the front room of the family's apartment, the shelves behind her holding the objects Claire had photographed in the 6th crate's velvet box. The ivory figure was visible on the upper left shelf, exactly where Miriam had said it was. Rachel had also sent the letter her mother had written in 1998, the year Rachel turned 40, addressed to whoever eventually found what they were looking for. It was 2 pages in handwriting that had the slightly careful quality of someone writing in their second language. It explained what the objects were, where they had come from, what the family had lost, and what they had saved. It said that if you were reading this, you'd found something that my family has been looking for a very long time. Please treat it gently. It has had a difficult journey. Claire had read that letter 3 times, and each time had to set it down and do something else for a while before she could return to whatever she'd been working on. The formal authentication of the second interior, the woman at the window, was completed in February. The process had taken 12 weeks from Dr. Firth's preliminary assessment, involving peer review by 2 additional specialists from European institutions, full pigment analysis conducted at the Rijksmuseum's Technical Laboratory in Amsterdam, and a detailed provenance report prepared by a researcher at the Commission for Looted Art in Europe who traced the painting's movement from the Hartmann apartment in Amsterdam in 1941 through the ERR's inventory records, to a German collection during the war years, and then into a gap in the documentation that ended when Otto Donovan left Stuttgart in 1951. The authentication was published in the Burlington magazine, the leading peer-reviewed journal for art historical scholarship, in a paper whose title translated from academic to plain language as follows: a painting that had been missing for 80 years had been found in a storage unit in Dallas, Texas. The response was not immediate. Academic publications move slowly, and the art world's attention is distributed across a large surface. But within a week of the Burlington paper appearing, the story had been picked up by the New York Times Arts desk, and within a week after that, it had moved beyond art's coverage into something broader. The story of the paintings was one part of it. The story of how they were found was another, and it turned out that the second story was the one that traveled faster and further. A woman who had bought her ex-husband's forgotten storage unit for $25 at a public auction. An art historian's training given up 14 years earlier and never quite lost. A $1 bid on knowledge nobody else in the parking lot possessed. A woman at a window painted in Delft in the 17th century, waiting in the dark in a climate-controlled unit in Dallas for the right person to open the door. Claire had not sought the coverage. She had spoken to one journalist, the Times reporter who called her through Veronica Sloane's office, because Veronica said the story was going to run regardless, and it was better to have some control over the framing. She answered the questions honestly and asked that Emma Hartmann, Miriam's mother, be identified in the piece by name, that the family's history be told fully, that the story not be reduced to the storage unit auction and the dollar amount. The reporter agreed and delivered on it. The piece ran on a Sunday and led with Miriam's 1998 letter and ended with what had been decided between Claire and Rachel over the previous 6 weeks. Donna called at 8:15 Sunday morning, which meant she'd read the piece online before the physical paper appeared anywhere. "I'm reading the New York Times right now," she said, in the voice of someone who was still processing what they were reading while on the phone to confirm they were reading it correctly. "I know. It says the collection is valued at up to $120 million. That's the high estimate for the full collection at auction under optimal conditions. The actual figure will depend on how the authentication holds up for each individual work and what the market looks like when they go to sale." "Claire, Donna, you bought a storage unit for $25. "I did. After I told you not to go." "You did. I told you it was probably old tools. I said showing up to bid on Marcus's storage unit seemed desperate." "You did say that." A pause. When her sister spoke again, the careful voice was entirely gone. What was left was Donna without the management, which was something Claire hadn't heard in years, not since before their father died, not since before they'd both become the particular adults the decades had made them. I am so sorry. I am genuinely sorry. You had a knowledge and a feeling, and I reduced it to desperation because I couldn't see past the surface of what you were doing. I should have asked you more questions. I should have said, you have a master's degree in this. Why are you going to an auction? What do you know that I don't? You couldn't have known what I knew. But I could have asked. I could have treated you like someone who knew things instead of someone who was making a mistake. Her voice caught slightly. I have not done that consistently enough. In this year, or in years before. Claire sat with that. It was the most honest thing her sister had said to her in a long time, possibly in their adult lives, and it landed differently than she expected. Not with vindication exactly. More like the relief of a window being opened in a room that's been closed too long. You're apologizing to me, Claire said. Yes. Accepted. She meant it. Call Mom, and then call me back. I'm going to call Mom, and then I'm going to call you back, and you're going to tell me everything, and I mean everything, including the part where the judge threw out Marcus's claim, because I read that part twice, and I want to hear it in your voice. That part, Claire said. I'm happy to tell you. Claire told her about the arrangement she and Rachel had worked out. It had taken 3 conversations and 2 sessions with their respective attorneys and 1 long afternoon on the phone where they'd mostly talked about their mothers, but they had arrived at something that both of them felt was right. The collection would be returned to the Hartmann heirs. All 7 works, the decorative objects, the manuscript. Every piece that had been sitting in Unit 4C since 2017 would go back to the family that had lost them in 1941. That was not in question. It had never been in question, not for Claire. The legal right to keep them was real, and Veronica had documented it thoroughly. But a legal right and the right thing were not always the same shape. And Claire had understood the difference since the Monday night she'd read about Miriam Hartmann Goldstein filing a restitution inquiry at the age of 88. The family had made a separate decision about what would happen to the works once returned. They had been planning, for decades, to sell the major pieces at auction and use the proceeds to establish a foundation in Miriam's name that would fund restitution research and support Jewish cultural institutions in the Netherlands. The recovery of the collection made that possible. In recognition of Claire's role in finding the works, protecting them legally against Marcus's claim, and choosing to contact the heirs rather than exercise her legal right of ownership, Rachel and the other family members had agreed unanimously to designate Claire as the recovery finder and to award her 15% of the net auction proceeds from the sale of the collection. The Christie's estimate for the collection at auction ranged from $60 million to $120 million, depending on final authentication and market conditions. 15% of the midpoint of that range was approximately $13.5 million. Donna did not say anything for a full 30 seconds after Claire finished explaining this. 13, Donna said. It could be less. It could be more. The auction hasn't happened yet. $13 million. Approximately. Because you went to a storage unit auction after I told you not to. Because I went to a storage unit auction after you told me not to. And because I had training I'd set aside for 14 years that turned out to matter. And because Miriam Hartmann Goldstein's daughter was still looking. And because I decided that finding something doesn't mean you own it. Claire paused. Also because Marcus canceled the credit card connected to the storage payment and forgot he'd done it. Donna laughed. It was abrupt and genuine and slightly undone. The laugh of someone who has reached the outer limit of what surprise can do to a person. I'm going to call you back, she said. I need to call Mom first, and then I'm going to call you back. Their mother called before Donna could. She had read the piece, too, and she cried with less restraint than Donna and for longer, and what she said in between the crying was that she'd always known, that Claire was built for something she hadn't found yet, and that this was it, and that she was proud, and that Claire's father would have been proud, and that $25 was the best $25 any member of this family had ever spent in 3 generations. She said other things, too, smaller things about the apartment in Garland and the call center shifts and the fold-out couch. Things she'd been holding for months because Claire had told her not to worry, and she said them now with the particular relief of a parent who has been carrying concern in private for a long time and can finally put it down. Claire listened. She didn't redirect or minimize. She let her mother say the things she'd needed to say, and she said yes. And she said, I know. and she said it's okay now. When they hung up, Donna called back as promised. Okay, Donna said. Tell me the part about the judge throwing out Marcus's claim. Word for word. Claire told her. Donna made a sound that was equal parts satisfaction and something older, the particular sound of a younger sister watching the scales come level after a long time tilted in the wrong direction. Good, she said. When she said it a second time, it was quieter and more deliberate. Good. Claire agreed. She called Rachel once a week. They had moved from the formal exchange of people managing a situation to the ongoing conversation of two people who had decided they wanted to keep talking. Rachel sent her photographs from the foundation's early work. Claire sent her photographs from Fort Worth, the view from the kitchen window, a picture of the couch that didn't fold out, a photograph of Daniel on a Sunday afternoon sitting at the four-chair table eating lunch and looking entirely at home. Rachel wrote back, I'm glad you have a proper table. My mother always said everything important happened at the table. She was right about most things. Claire printed that email and put it on the refrigerator with a magnet. She looked at it most mornings while she made her coffee. She was not sure why. She thought it had something to do with the fact that she'd been doing her crying in private, in the evenings over the 6 weeks of the process, small amounts at a time, the way you manage something large by not letting it accumulate. She'd cried reading Miriam's letter. She'd cried after the first call with Rachel when she'd hung up and understood what that conversation had contained. She'd cried once, briefly, in the parking lot of the storage facility after Elise's assessment, sitting in the Civic with the engine running, not because of the money, but because of the particular coincidence of events that had delivered her to that parking lot on that December morning. She had bought a house for $25 that her ex-husband forgot he owned because a credit card was canceled and a notice went to the wrong address, and she had a feeling on a November morning that she couldn't fully explain and acted on it anyway. The auction was scheduled for May. Christie's New York, an evening sale, the kind held under bright lights with a room full of serious people and a telephone bidding bank staffed by specialists managing clients who preferred not to appear in person. Claire flew to New York for it at Rachel's invitation. She had never been to a Christie's evening sale. She had attended plenty of auction previews and auction days at Hartley and Crane, the mid-market kind where the room held 30 people and the catalog ran to 400 lots. This was something different. Rachel met her at the airport. She was a tall woman with her mother's precise quality of attention, gray-haired and composed, wearing a coat that was clearly a good coat without being showy about it. They had spoken 10 times on the phone and had exchanged dozens of emails and had not yet met in person, and the meeting in the arrivals hall of JFK was briefly and unexpectedly formal in the way that encounters between people who have shared something significant sometimes were, before they calibrated. You're shorter than I expected, Rachel said. Everyone says that. Claire offered her hand and Rachel shook it and then, after a brief pause, pulled her into a hug that lasted long enough to be real. They had dinner that night, Rachel and her husband and 2 of Rachel's adult children, at a restaurant in Park Slope that was warm and not quiet and full of people having ordinary evenings. Claire had brought Daniel, who had taken a week off from his spring semester at UT Arlington, where he'd started in January, partly because he wanted to be there and partly because Claire had told him the full story in January, and he'd sat on the fold-out couch in Garland listening for an hour and then said, quietly, I can't believe you went to that auction. Your aunt told me not to. You went anyway. I had a feeling. He'd been quiet for a moment. I'm glad you did. A pause. I'm glad you're okay, Mom. Like actually okay. At the dinner table in Park Slope, Daniel talked to Rachel's grandchildren with the ease of a 20-year-old who hadn't yet lost the social flexibility that would calcify later, and Rachel talked to Claire about what the foundation would do and who they'd already been in contact with and what it had meant to the family to see the story in print, to have it be real after so many years of it being the thing they waited for without knowing if the waiting would ever end. My mother believed they'd come back, Rachel said. I believed it less. After she died, I believed it even less. And then you called from Dallas, Texas, and you sent me a photograph of a nick in the base of an ivory figure that my grandmother kept on a shelf. What do you think that shelf was like? Claire said, the front room shelf. Do you know anything about the apartment? Rachel looked at her for a moment. I know quite a lot about it, actually. My mother described every room. She paused. When the foundation is running, one of the things we want to do is commission a reconstruction. Not physical, but research-based. Documenting the apartment, what was in it, what the family's life looked like before, so that it's on record, so that no one can say it didn't exist. The auction the next evening lasted 3 hours. The Hartmann collection was distributed across the evening's lots rather than grouped together, which Christie's had advised would maximize each work's individual impact on bidders who were following the sale as a whole. The interior with the woman at the window was Lot 23, positioned as the emotional and commercial centerpiece of the sale. The work whose story had driven the coverage and whose provenance had been the subject of the Burlington paper and the Times piece, and a documentary segment aired 2 weeks before the sale by a public broadcaster in the Netherlands. Claire and Rachel sat together in the 4th row. The room held perhaps 200 people, catalog pages, the restrained murmur of conversations that went quiet as the auctioneer mounted the podium. The early lots moved efficiently, the auctioneer's cadence steady and unhurried. Numbers called and met and advanced in the particular rhythm of a room that had done this many times and understood that the rhythm was part of what made the money real. Lot 23 was preceded by a provenance note that the auctioneer read aloud in full. The Hartmann family of Amsterdam. The 1937 inventory. The forced departure in 1941. The 80 years of absence from the documented record. The recovery in Dallas in December of the previous year. He read it without inflection or dramatization, the way you read facts that were large enough to need no amplification. The room was very quiet. Then the bidding opened at $12 million. Claire had attended previews and auction days and appraisal sessions and estate sales and had never been in a room where numbers moved like this, where the increment of each bid was larger than anything she'd earned in 5 years. The bids came from the telephone bank along the right wall, where specialists in dark suits held phones to their ears and raised hands with practiced efficiency, and from a digital bidding display at the back of the room, and from 2 people seated in the hall itself who raised paddles at intervals with the composure of people for whom $30 million was a comprehensible figure in an immediate and personal way. The field narrowed at $22 million to 2 telephone bidders, neither of whom was visible, both of whom were patient in a way that made the pauses between bids feel measured rather than hesitant. The numbers moved in increments of 1 million now. 23, 24, 25. At 29 million the room had gone very still. At 31, Rachel's hand closed around Claire's without either of them deciding to do it. At 33, one of the telephone specialists lowered her phone and spoke quietly to her colleague and stepped back from the bank. The hammer came down at $34,200,000. The room released its breath. Not quite applause, not quite silence. Something between them, the particular sound of a large number being absorbed. Rachel held Claire's hand through the rest of the sale. The full collection realized $88 million. The decorative objects sold separately over a second day and added another $4 million. The manuscript, which turned out to be a 16th-century illuminated devotional text of considerable rarity, realized $7 million in a specialist books and manuscripts sale 3 weeks later. The total across all the Hartmann works, $99 million for $100,000. 15% was $14,910,000. On the day the wire transfer cleared, Claire called Dr. Hollis and canceled their biweekly appointment. Not because she was done with the work they'd been doing together, but because she was moving to a different insurance plan that allowed for a different schedule, and she wanted to take a break before starting again. Dr. Hollis said that made sense, and that she was glad things had developed the way they had, and that she'd said, hadn't she, that Claire was built around something specific that she hadn't found yet. You said that in our 3rd session, Claire said. And you were right. She gave notice at the call center on a Tuesday. Terence accepted it with the same patient composure he applied to everything, and said genuinely that she'd been good at the job, which was true, and that he hoped the next thing went well, which she thought it would. Pam walked her to the parking lot on her last day and said she'd known from the beginning that Claire was not a person who was going to stay in a call center indefinitely. She said it with the kind of confidence that comes from saying something after the fact that you could not have said before it. Claire thanked her and meant it. The next thing was already in motion. She'd called Hartley and Crane in Fort Worth 2 weeks earlier. The firm was still operating, under different management since the partners who'd hired her had both retired, and when she explained who she was and what she'd been doing for the past 6 months and mentioned, without excessive detail, that she'd recently been involved in the authentication and provenance research for a collection that had been featured in the Burlington magazine and the New York Times. The managing director had paused for approximately 4 seconds before saying yes, they'd be very interested in discussing an arrangement. She found an apartment in Fort Worth, 2 bedrooms, proper rooms with proper walls, on a floor high enough that she could see the skyline from the kitchen window when the weather was clear. She bought a bed, an actual bed with a frame and a headboard and sheets she chose herself without looking at the price tag. A couch that didn't fold out, because she was going to sleep in a bed from now on and have separate furniture for sitting. A table with 4 chairs because Daniel was going to visit on weekends now that she was 40 minutes from UT Arlington and she wanted there to be places for people to sit. A television, for the same reason. She paid off the balance on every account she held. She paid Veronica Sloan in full and added a bonus that made Veronica say, after a brief surprised pause, that she appreciated it. She sent a contribution to the Afar's education fund because it was Elise's professional home and because it did work that mattered. She sent a gift to a veterinary fund for service animals in Dallas because Storm still felt relevant somehow, even if he belonged to a different story. She did not move to a mansion. She did not buy a second car. She did not call anyone to announce what she had or hadn't done with the money, because it turned out that the most important thing about having enough was how little it changed what she cared about. She cared about the apartment with the skyline view. She cared about the work at Hartley and Crane, which she'd started 2 weeks after giving notice at the call center and which felt, from the first morning, like a room she'd been in before and had missed. She cared about the Wednesday evening calls with Daniel, which had lengthened from their careful 7 to 12 minutes to something that didn't have a fixed end time. She cared about her mother and her sister and the ongoing conversation with Rachel, who sent her photographs from the foundation's early work and who was becoming, slowly and in the particular way that adult friendships formed, a person she was genuinely glad to know. They had moved from the formal exchange of people managing a situation to the ongoing conversation of 2 people who had decided they wanted to keep talking. Rachel sent her photographs from the foundation's early work. Claire sent her photographs from Fort Worth, the view from the kitchen window, a picture of the couch that didn't fold out. In March, 5 months after the auction, Claire stood in a conference room at Christie's New York at a small ceremony where the formal provenance documentation of the collection was transferred to the Hartmann Family Foundation. Several people spoke. Dr. Firth spoke about the authentication process. The director of the Commission for Looted Art in Europe spoke about what the recovery meant in the context of broader restitution efforts. A representative from the Dutch government spoke briefly about the works returning, at least in their documented history, to the culture from which they'd been taken. Rachel spoke last. She talked about her mother, about the filing cabinet with the folder, about the contact information updated every time the law firm changed addresses, about a woman who had described an ivory figure in such detail that her daughter could identify it from a photograph taken in a Dallas storage unit. She talked about what it meant for the record to be complete, for the gap to close. Then she talked about Claire. She said that there were people who found things and claimed them, and people who found things and understood that finding wasn't the same as owning. She said that the second kind of person was rarer than the first, and that the story of the Hartmann collection was not only the story of 80 years of a family waiting. It was the story of a woman who'd lost almost everything she had and was given a chance to take something back and chose, instead, to give something back. She said that her mother had written, in that 1998 letter, that if you were reading this, please treat it gently. It has had a difficult journey. She said Claire had done that. She'd treated it gently. She'd understood the journey. Claire sat in the 4th row of the conference room and listened to this and did not try to manage what she was feeling. Daniel was sitting next to her. He'd driven up from the city that morning, arriving at the hotel at 9 with the blazer she'd bought him for his birthday and a borrowed tie and his characteristic expression of someone trying not to look like they were paying close attention while in fact paying very close attention. He'd been quiet through most of Rachel's remarks. Not restless quiet, not checking his phone quiet, listening quiet. When Rachel finished, he leaned over to Claire and said, at a volume audible only to her, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "That picture you have. Of you at the Denver Art Museum. The one with the cracked glass." She looked at him. "In the cardboard box," he said. "From the apartment in Garland. You had it on the floor when I visited that first time." I picked it up and looked at it and didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. You looked so different in it. Not younger, not that. You just looked like yourself. And then you stopped looking like yourself. And now you look like that picture again. He said it with the straightforwardness of someone who had been saving the observation and had finally found the right moment. Claire looked at her son, who was 19 years old and had grown up watching his parents' marriage from the inside, and had chosen his father's house because his father had the dog and the continuity and the life that looked like a life from the outside, and who was sitting in a Christie's conference room in New York in March watching his mother receive public acknowledgement for something she'd done alone on a December morning, with $40 and a feeling she couldn't explain. She put her arm around him and held on. He let her and leaned in slightly, the way he used to when he was small, and they were watching something on the couch, and he'd shift toward her without acknowledging the shift. The particular physical grammar of a child who still needed his mother but was old enough to be careful about showing it. They stayed like that until the room began to move around them. On the flight back to Dallas that evening, Daniel slept in the window seat, and Claire sat next to him with the cabin light on and let the preceding months arrange themselves in their proper order. The cardboard box on the floor of the Garland apartment, the fold-out couch, the email she'd almost deleted, her sister's voice telling her it was probably old tools, the $25, the smell of linseed oil in a climate-controlled unit on South Buckner Boulevard, the woman at the window, the light from the left, the 4 Dutch words on the back of a stretcher bar, Family Hartmann, Amsterdam, 1938, a woman who had described an ivory figure to her daughter so that someone would know it when it came home. A daughter who'd kept the description and the inventory and the contact information current through 60 years of waiting, and who had filed an updated inquiry at the age of 88 using borrowed email, because she wasn't going to be the reason the trail went cold. She had given up 14 years of the work she loved for a man who forgot to pay a storage unit. She had spent 11 months in 400 square feet with a fold-out couch and a French press and a spreadsheet that documented a slow emergency. She had driven 22 miles to an auction her sister told her not to attend and bought a forgotten unit for $25 because she had training she hadn't used and a feeling she couldn't explain and $40 in her pocket, which turned out to be more than enough. She had called the heirs instead of calling a lawyer. That was the whole story, or the part of it that fit in a single sentence. What it didn't contain was all the rest of it, the specific weight of an ivory figure in a velvet box. A woman in Brooklyn who sent photographs from a foundation that bore her mother's name. A son who saw her looking like herself again. A 2-bedroom apartment in Fort Worth with a skyline view she looked at every morning while making coffee. The work at Hartley and Crane, where she sat with things that had traveled far from where they started and tried to read their histories and put the record straight. The particular satisfaction of doing the thing you were built to do with the years you have. She didn't know exactly what was coming next. She knew it would involve looking carefully. It would involve paying the kind of attention that other people skipped. It would involve understanding that finding something and owning it were different categories, and that the second didn't always follow the first, and that sometimes the best thing you could do with what you found was give it back. She closed her eyes. She slept the rest of the way home. 3 months later, she took a provenance case referred to Hartley and Crane by a law firm in Houston, an estate in Beaumont, a family clearing a house after an elderly man's death, a painting in the attic that didn't look like it belonged. She drove out on a Tuesday with her case and her loupe and her portable UV lamp. She stood in a room that smelled of old newspapers and looked at a painting that had been sitting in the wrong house for as long as anyone could remember. She knew, in the first 30 seconds, that it didn't belong there. The painting in the attic in Beaumont measured approximately 24 by 36 inches, oil on canvas, and the family had leaned it against a water heater under a moving blanket for what the eldest son estimated was 20 years. His name was Gerald Tran. He was 51, and he had grown up in this house without ever being told the painting had any significance. His mother had called it the boat picture. She'd moved it upstairs when she redecorated in 2003, and nobody had moved it since. It was not a boat picture. The subject was a harbor scene. That much was accurate. A port at dusk with figures on the dock and a vessel in the middle distance. But the handling of the sky was the thing that stopped Claire in the first few seconds. The way the light distributed itself across the cloud cover, the specific orange-gray of a harbor at the end of the working day, was not the work of an amateur or a decorative artist. It was the work of someone who had spent years watching sky and water and understood their relationship as a technical problem requiring a technical solution. She took the painting to the attic window and tilted it at a low angle. The craquelure told her it was old. The stretcher bars told her it was American, the style of their construction consistent with a period before standardized production. The canvas grain, where it showed at the tacking edges, was a heavy linen of the kind in common use in the second half of the 19th century. None of that was conclusive. None of it needed to be yet. She turned it over. On the back of the canvas, in pencil, a name and a date. Not the painter's name. An exhibition label, partially detached, from an institution in New York. She photographed it before touching it. The label was from 1887, which if authentic made this canvas 138 years old, and the institution named on the label had been one of the most important venues for American painting in the decades following the Civil War. Gerald Tran was standing in the attic doorway watching her with the expression of someone who had expected to be told the painting was worth between $200 and $800 at a local auction house. "Where did your family acquire this?" Claire asked. "My grandfather bought it somewhere. Maybe an estate sale, maybe a dealer. He wasn't specific about it. He just liked it. When 1960s, I think. He was collecting American landscapes at the time. He had 3 or 4, but the others were smaller and less interesting, or so my mother always said." "Do you have records from his collection? Purchase receipts, insurance appraisals, anything in writing?" Gerald disappeared downstairs. Claire stayed in the attic with the painting and the light from the single window, and the accumulated silence of a house being sorted through by people who hadn't fully understood yet what they were sorting through. She looked at the painting for another minute. The harbor. The figures on the dock rendered with an economy of brushwork that was not shorthand but precision, each silhouette carrying its weight in the composition without demanding attention. The vessel in the middle distance sitting in the water with the specific gravity of something painted by a person who understood how ships sat in water rather than simply how they looked from a distance. She knew who painted this. She was not certain. She would not say it aloud until she had documentation and a second opinion and the humility that the process required of everyone who worked in it, including people who had recently been right about something very large. Being right once was not a credential. It was a single data point. But she knew. Gerald came back with a shoebox. Inside, a manila envelope, and inside that, a receipt dated September 1963, a dealer in Houston, a name on the receipt that matched the name she was not yet saying aloud. A purchase price of $340, which in 1963 had been a serious but not extraordinary sum for an American landscape by a painter whose reputation had, in the decades since, grown considerably beyond what any Houston dealer in 1963 had understood it would become. She wrote the dealer's name in her notebook. She wrote the date and the amount. She photographed the receipt 3 times from different angles. "I'll need to take this with me for examination," she said. "I'll provide you with a full written receipt and a preliminary report within 2 weeks. I'd also recommend you contact your homeowner's insurance and request a temporary rider while the assessment is in progress." Gerald looked at the painting, then at her. "Should I be sitting down for whatever you're about to tell me? I'm not going to tell you anything today except that your grandfather had a good eye and you should insure it immediately." She paused. "But yes, when I call you in 2 weeks, you may want to be sitting down." She carried the painting to her car wrapped in the clean cloth she kept in her case for exactly this purpose. She set it in the back seat with the care of someone who understood that the thing she was transporting was not an object in the ordinary sense. It was a record. It was a document of a specific person's attention to a specific sky above a specific harbor on a specific evening 138 years ago. It had sat against a water heater in Beaumont, Texas, for 20 years because nobody had known to look at it properly. She looked at it properly. That was the job. She drove back toward Fort Worth in the late afternoon with the painting in the back seat and the highway unreeling ahead of her and the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who had found what they were looking for and understood that this was not the last time they would find it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.